Chapter 81. The Red Earl's Reward. Charles cherished his morning ritual of reading the Gazette. It kept him informed of the wider world and made for a pleasant pastime on his plush leather recliner. Today, as Paul carefully unfolded the newspaper across the tabletop, 2 sealed reward notices slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Paul glanced down, scooped them up, and then froze. His eyes widened as he read the printed figures. A low gasp escaped him, and soon everyone nearby had gathered to peer over his shoulder. 1, 10, 100, 100 million, 10, 10, 1 billion. Paul stammered, voice trembling. "Boss, you're wanted. The Navy's offering a reward, 1 billion. He could hardly believe the number he'd just spoken. Without another thought, Paul dashed across the room and held the notices out to Charles with shaking hands. Charles let the newspaper fall aside and squinted sleepily at Paul. "What's all the excitement about?" "Look, boss, your reward notices. Both of them," Paul insisted, thrusting the papers closer. Charles stretched, then took the notices in hand. He smoothed them out, studied the bold insignia of the Admiralty at the top, and finally met Paul's wide-eyed stare. "A billion," Charles murmured. "It seems I've climbed quite a bit on the Navy's most wanted list." He folded the notices neatly, slipping them into his pocket. Around him, the room buzzed with stunned whispers. "For the Red Earl," Charles said with a small, wry smile, "that's a handsome sum." And in that moment, it was clear the stakes had just grown far higher than anyone could have anticipated. Charles glanced at the latest wanted poster and let out a low chuckle. 5 million more? Big whoop. He flicked the paper away, his tone dismissive. Paul darted forward and caught it midair. "Boss, you don't get it. Once your bounty reaches 1 billion, you'll be a true legend. Every port will know your name." He spread his arms wide, as if conjuring fame itself. Charles only smirked. "And why would I want that?" He arched an eyebrow at his first mate. "Since when did I care about someone else's opinion of me?" Paul scratched his head, a grin tugging at his lips. He'd long known his captain had little use for prestige or gold, only raw power, and, apparently, beautiful women. After all, Charles's ship boasted a crew of smiling faces rather than cannon barrels, a stark contrast to other pirate vessels bristling with guns. Paul shook his head in amused disbelief, watching Charles return his gaze with cool confidence. "Besides," Charles added, folding his arms, "if word of us really spreads, the real fun has only just begun." He paused, eyes glinting with mischief. "Isn't that worth more than any price on my head?" Paul broke into a hearty laugh. "Aye, boss. You're something else." He tucked the wanted poster under his arm and led the way back to the quarterdeck, already plotting their next adventure. Charles gave Paul a searching look. "You look troubled. Are you thinking something bad?" At those words, Paul broke out in a cold sweat. "What? How could you think that? You're my beloved master," he stammered, forcing a shaky smile. Charles simply stared at him for a moment, then closed his eyes again. Paul knew the master was preparing for a rest, so he bowed and turned to leave. Just as he reached the door, a slip of paper drifted from the newspaper in his hand and fluttered to the floor. Curious, Paul bent to retrieve it. The notice showed 2 men. Although one figure was only seen from behind, Paul recognized the silhouette at once. It was his master. Who was the other man? He leaned closer and read the printed name. Patrick Redfield, the Red Earl. Paul felt his legs go weak. Then his eyes flew to the reward amount. 50 million Baileys, he gasped, staring as if he'd seen a ghost. At that, Charles shot upright in his recliner. He snatched the paper from Paul's trembling fingers and studied it in stunned silence. Chapter 7. Ha! Charles threw back his head and laughed until his sides ached. The proclamation in the morning's Gazette was too delicious to resist. His booming guffaws echoed through the corridor, drawing every eye. Never before had anyone seen Charles this elated. The guests and staff exchanged curious glances. What could have set him off? But if it made him this happy, it couldn't be bad news. "Ryder, you still can't outdo me," Charles roared, clutching the broadsheet. "I told you I'd come out on top." Voices hushed and whispers rustled like leaves in the wind. Some smiled at his rare display of triumph. Others just shook their heads. Charles barely noticed. He was too busy basking in the glory of his victory. Far out at sea, a lone cutter sliced through roiling waves under a gunmetal sky. On its stern, A figure cloaked in crimson glared down at the same gazette that had caused Charles's outburst. His knuckles whitened around the paper's edge, veins throbbing on his forehead. "Curse the Navy," he snarled. This was the Red Earl, infamous and proud. His private vessel pitched and rolled as he cursed every line printed in that damned newspaper. Somewhere ahead lay the narrow straits leading to the Chambord Isles, a bastion he and his fleet used for covert rendezvous. Now, like Charles, his own name featured in the global bulletin. Wanted, dead or alive. He ripped a corner from the edge and let it flutter into the sea. Salty spray stung his eyes as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon. They'd post me alongside him. The Red Earl bared his teeth. We'll see how they like facing one of us at a time. He thrust the rest of the paper into his coat, squared his shoulders against the wind, and stared ahead at the unseen isles lurking beyond the gray mist. The game had begun in earnest, and this time, neither man would yield. Patrick Redfield, better known on the seas as the Red Earl, had suddenly become the hottest name in every harbor and port. Not because of any reputation he'd built, but simply due to the monstrous bounty slapped on his head, 75 million berries. The number alone was enough to make every bounty hunter drool with greed. An unknown pirate carrying that kind of price tag? Instant frenzy. The Navy's bulletins were maddeningly vague. They gave no backstory on the Red Earl, only a brief mention of heinous crimes so shocking that speculation ran wild and rumors spread faster than wildfire. In taverns from East Blue to the Grand Line, the same cry went up over and over. "I'm coming for you, Red Earl. Want that bounty." Beside that dazzling reward, another poster had just gone up. It bore the face of Charles, formerly known as Charlotte, and his bounty, too, was formidable. Yet no one paid it the slightest attention. Who dared make a move against Charles after hearing how he had cut down over 1,000 men in the capital of the Seven Seas? Ordinary hunters knew they'd be lucky to survive the attempt. The simultaneous release of these two wanted notices sent shockwaves through every shipping lane. Seafarers spoke in hushed, terrified tones about Charles's strength, how no one could slip through his grasp unscathed. Only the most desperate or the utterly reckless would even think of hunting him. And somewhere, amid the clink of mugs in a shadowy tavern corner, rang a mocking laugh. "Rayleigh! Ha!" "That strike team on the rock ship pulled off another massive operation," Roger exclaimed, waving a newspaper in triumph. Rayleigh ignored his outburst. He frowned and met Roger's eyes. "Don't you think Locke's pirates have grown far too powerful?" Roger set the paper aside, took a steady swig from his drink, and laughed. "So what? I'm not afraid of them." His bluster echoed around the tavern. Rayleigh shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He admired Roger's audacity, but he wouldn't let the matter rest. "But have you considered the people under Locke's thumb? Their lives are misery, constant fear, arbitrary violence, endless uprisings." The words halted Roger. He lowered the bottle and fell silent. They were well into the New World now, and Roger couldn't ignore what he'd witnessed on the voyage. Island after island had come under Locke's control, each one stained by wanton slaughter and ceaseless civil strife. As the tavern's lanterns flickered, Roger finally acknowledged the weight of Rayleigh's words. Around them, the sea's promise of adventure seemed darker than ever before. Chapter 82, Roger's Plan. Roger paced the deck, frustration etched on his face. "I just heard from Siachi that Locke is searching for something called the Heavenly King, and it sounds like he finally has a lead." Rayleigh stopped polishing the railing and looked up. The moment Roger mentioned the Heavenly King, the captain's usual roguish grin vanished, replaced by a keen, serious gaze. Roger turned back to Rayleigh and asked quietly, "Will you help me?" Rayleigh hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden, weighty question, but nodded before he could think it through. At that, Roger threw back his head and laughed. "Excellent. Now we wait for Locke to slip up. The moment he does, we strike and end this once and for all." He draped an arm over Rayleigh's shoulders, his confidence unshakable. Rayleigh, watching his friend's fierce determination, felt a surge of loyalty. "I'm with you always," he said firmly. "I know you are," Roger replied, cracking a rare, genuine smile. They exchanged knowing looks, and then laughter. Their boisterous chuckles rang out across the deck, drawing every crew member's attention. The sailors exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what had set their usually composed captain and first mate off into such joyful mirth. Roger and Rayleigh shared a low laugh before Roger finally wiped a tear from his eye and spoke quietly. Honestly, the Rock's pirates are hopelessly fractured. Every crew out there has its own agenda. Once Rox himself is gone, the whole alliance will fall apart. He turned to Rayleigh, eyes glinting as he clenched his fist. I take it you're not worried about Whitebeard, Golden Lion Shiki, Charlotte Linlin, or that fearsome swordswoman Charlotte? Rayleigh studied him for a moment. Those four are easily the strongest captains under Rox right now. Do you really think we can take them on? Roger shook his head with a confident smile. Not worried in the slightest. We've already sized up each of them. Take Whitebeard. He's made it clear he wants out of the Rock's pirates, but he's kept bound by his sense of honor. He won't lift a hand to protect Rox, though he won't openly rebel either. Then there's Shiki, the Golden Lion. He's fiercely ambitious, absolutely the type who'll strike out on his own at the first opportunity. As for Charlotte Linlin, she's dangerous, but she isn't organized enough to mount a serious defense once her leader is gone. And that red-bladed swordswoman, her skill is undeniable, but she's not on our level. Rayleigh's expression grew serious. So the plan is simple. Eliminate Rox first. With him dead, the crews will splinter. Whitebeard will slip away, Shiki will carve out his own empire, and the two Charlottes, well, you know how quickly sword-driven loyalties shift. By then, there'll be nothing left holding the Rock's pirates together. Roger nodded, eyes alight. Exactly. Strike hard, strike fast, and the rest will fall into place. As for Charlotte Lingling, we've never met her in person, Roger began, but the word is she's more interested in starting a family and building her own little nation than meddling in our affairs. She won't stand in our way. That leaves Rockefeller Charlotte. He paused, glancing at Raleigh. The only one of the four we haven't accounted for. I've never seen him myself, but I hear Locke forced him into the fold. He'll back any plan to eliminate Locke. If he doesn't act, at least he won't interfere. Raleigh nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. Then the only real obstacles left are Wang Ji, John Silveraxe, and the mysterious captain of the 7th Division, Hayton Muchen. Wang Ji and Silveraxe have been Locke's closest allies since he first took to the sea, but they're past their prime. Let your men handle them. As for Hayton Muchen, Locke only promoted him because he needed something the man possessed. His capabilities are negligible. He poses no real threat. In the end, there's just one enemy we need to worry about, Locke himself. Once Locke is dead, his crew will crumble, Roger declared, gazing at Rayleigh with unwavering confidence. His conviction was so absolute that even Rayleigh found himself nodding in agreement. In Roger's estimation, the Locke pirates, who'd had the temerity to break ties with Navy headquarters, were nothing more than a desperate rabble. Their courage, while fierce, was nothing extraordinary. So when do we strike? Rayleigh pressed, his excitement barely contained. Roger shook his head. Not yet. We wait. The moment Locke's guard is down, that's when we move in and finish him. Leaning casually against the rail of the ship, Roger let the wind whip his coat. Rayleigh smiled, trusting Roger's strategic patience. Patience, Roger murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon, just like a wolf lurking for the lion to tire. Meanwhile, on board a merchant schooner not far away, 18-year-old Charles stood at the rail, staring with mounting frustration at the smoke and flashes on the distant waves. This was the 4th time he'd been caught in the crossfire of a pirate bombardment, and all on the Grand Route. He remembered sailing through the New World only weeks before, venturing as far as Murloc Island, without so much as a stray cannonball. Why, then, did pirates swarm here like flies around a carcass? The sulphurous smell of gunpowder stung Charles's nostrils as yet another volley splashed the water nearby. He gripped the rail tightly, his jaw set. Out here on the open sea, unpredictability was the only constant, and Charles was determined not to let it break him. Charles peered over the rail as another line of cannon fire streaked past the bow. Ever since they'd left the capital of 7 Waters, pirate ships had been shadowing them every 2 or 3 days. No warnings, no parley, just relentless bombardment. On deck, Paul and Isaac darted back and forth, knives flashing as they tried to deflect the iron shot before it punched through the hull. Every blast shook the single boat beneath their feet, sending splinters and spray across the deck. "This is the only vessel we have," Charles reminded himself. If the hull cracked, they'd be stranded in these desolate seas with no nearby ports or friendly harbors, just miles of open water and the slim hope that another ship might pass by. Around them, the nearest shoreline was a ghost town of abandoned villages, far from any trading post. Should their boat sink, they'd be cast away like driftwood. He watched the pirate brigantine hover at the edge of its cannon's range, retreating whenever Charles's small cutter tried to close the distance. The raiders were cunning, keeping their guns trained on the merchant ship while staying just out of reach. Each time Paul and Isaac surged forward, the brigantine backed off, raining broadsides down from safety. Charles rubbed his chin, weighing their options. They had agility and steel, but no heavy firepower. "Maybe it's time we prepared a few cannons of our own," he muttered. With enough guns to match their pursuers' range, they might finally turn the tables and protect the only lifeline they had on this unforgiving sea. Paul stared his boss in stunned silence. Why did he suddenly feel his commander was about to do something reckless? No, impossible. He is a renowned swordsman. Shaking off the doubt, Paul refocused on the cannonballs hurtling toward them. "It's time to end this farce," Charles said coolly, flicking his wrist as if dismissing a minor annoyance. Isaac and Paul exchanged eager looks. Could they truly witness the great swordsman's legendary slash once more? In an instant, Charles's eyes snapped sharp and bright. A powerful aura erupted around him, so intense that Paul and Isaac momentarily lost their breath. Their hearts pounded in awe. This was the unmistakable presence of a master swordsman. Charles tracked the incoming shells with unerring precision, then drew his long sword from its scabbard in one fluid motion. The blade flashed like lightning, slicing through the air toward the enemy pirate battery. In a brilliant arc of white steel, he intercepted the cannonballs, shattering them into harmless fragments that clattered onto the deck. Paul and Isaac watched with wide, ecstatic eyes. This was the dream of every swordsman, and right before them, Charles had just lived it. Chapter 83, The Legend of Aska Island. A low rumble of cannon fire echoed across the waves surrounding Aska Island as Charles lounged on deck. The pirate ship closing in had already unleashed volley after volley of iron shot, yet none had found their mark. At last, their captain, grinning with overconfidence, ordered another broadside. Charles sighed, sat up, and drew his longsword. There was no crackling aura, no flamboyant martial flourish, just the steady poise of a master swordsman. In a single, smooth motion, he swung. The blade cut through the air with a sharp whistle, slicing toward the pirate vessel. The raiders behind the cannon froze mid-loading. Their captain's jaw dropped in astonishment. Before a warning could be raised, Charles's slash met its target. The enemy ship's hull split cleanly in two, water gushing in as the timbers gave way like soft tofu. "Boss, you literally sliced their whole ship in half," Paul blurted, staring at the wreckage. Without missing a beat, Charles sheathed his sword, stretched his arms behind his head, and flopped back onto the chaise lounge. He closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Weren't we supposed to salvage whatever treasure they'd stowed aboard? The harvest festival's next week. Someone's got to supply the fireworks." Paul gaped. Right, treasure," he sighed, stepping toward the sinking hulk. "I'll go check the hold, then." Behind him, the firelight danced on broken planks, and the sea swallowed the last of the pirate ship's splintered keel. Charles drifted off into a nap, utterly unconcerned, as though nothing more than a midday breeze had disturbed the calm of Aska Bay. Charles watched the enemy ship list and finally slip beneath the waves. He only hoped its survivors would make it safely back to shore. With that, he slipped his sword back into its scabbard and turned away from the sinking wreck. Below him, on the pirate vessel now split clean in two by Charles's blade, the captain raged. "Damn it! Who are those bastards?" "Captain, get to the boat!" came the urgent shout from the first mate, standing in a small, rocking skiff alongside the wreck. Captain Hart glared at the shattered deck of his ship. "I don't care who they are," he bellowed. "But I, Hart, will never forget this, and mark my words, if I ever learn who you are, you'll regret it." With that, Hart leapt into the churning sea and began to dog paddle toward the skiff. Within moments, he hauled himself aboard. The first mate seized an oar, and they pushed off. "Captain, wait, we haven't rescued everyone," the first mate protested, glancing back at crewmen clambering desperately over the wreckage. Hart gripped the gunwale. "There's no time. Man for man, we can't all fit." He gave the first mate a hard look. "Row." Reluctantly, the first mate bent to his oars. The little boat surged away from the doomed pirate ship, leaving Charles alone on the quarterdeck, his sword still loose in its sheath, and his reputation further burnished by another victory at sea. "Wait for me!" The pirates who'd plunged into the sea thrashed and shouted as they watched their captain steer away. But Hart paid them no mind. To him, they were nothing more than expendable pawns. Fresh recruits were a dime a dozen the moment his name was spoken. "Bastards!" cried one of the drowning men, clinging to a plank. Hart merely shrugged and punched the rail of his wooden ship. His wrath wasn't for the men he'd abandoned, but for the ruin of everything he'd built in a single day. A month slipped by on the open water in grim silence. Then, "Captain, land ho! Aska Island dead ahead!" Charles, who'd been fishing over the side, let his rod clatter to the deck and sprinted to the bow. After weeks of salt spray and endless horizon, they'd reached their destination at last. He pressed forward, heart pounding. "My precious 7-star sword, your master has arrived," he thought. "What marvels await me now?" As the ship glided closer, Charles spotted a lone banner fluttering on the shore. Aska Island's welcome, or war, Ning, he could not yet tell. Charles stood at the prow, his gaze fixed on the fluttering seagull standard that marked the naval base ahead. A line of warships lay moored in the harbor, their flags snapping in the salt-scented breeze. He narrowed his eyes. "From now on," he called back to his crew, "we sail as merchants. No pirate colors, no bold maneuvers. Keep your heads down and your business honest. Understand?" His crew exchanged eager glances, then nodded in unison. They had rarely seen their captain so serious. But with the 7-star sword still out of reach, Charles dared not risk drawing attention to their true purpose. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't reveal their identity until the time was right. The ship eased closer to the bustling quay without raising alarm. Fishermen unloaded mackerel, traders haggled over spices, dockhands heaved barrels and crates to and fro. The island's prosperity was unmistakable, and no wonder a naval detachment was stationed here to protect these rich trade routes. Charles brushed a hand over the glimmering golden whiskers he had carefully glued to his chin, a bold disguise, but necessary to mask his youth and pirate origins. He straightened his merchant's coat, adopted a modest gait, and prepared to enter the harbor as nothing more than another humble trader. Charles gathered himself, adopting the calm confidence of a seasoned merchant as the boat eased into the dock. His coat, trimmed in gold thread, and neatly groomed beard spoke of both wealth and good taste. When the plank lowered, he was the first to disembark. The waterfront crowd paused, casting admiring glances at his finery and the assurance in his stride. It was clear, another prosperous trader had come ashore. Before him lay the bustling harbor, alive with creaking masts and colorful sails, and beyond it rose the island's great central peak. As he took in the scene, an old legend awakened in his mind. Long ago, the island's people had trembled at the sight of the blood-red full moon. To quell their terror, the gods had granted them 2 divine gifts, a radiant shield and a mighty sword. But destiny turned tragic. They say the 7-star sword, the very blade the gods had forged, later became an instrument of heartbreak. In the kingdom of Aska, 3 princes encountered the same mysterious witch, and each pledged his love to her. To win her favor, all 3 drew that sacred sword and challenged one another for the throne. Their clash sparked a war so fierce that earth and sea themselves seemed to weep, mourning the countless innocent lives lost in its wake. Charles let the memory settle as he stepped away from the dock, determination glinting in his eyes. The legends of old might speak of gods and curses, but today he had his own journey to begin. Long ago, the 7-star sword was hailed as a holy blade, until the resentment and blood of countless victims seeped into its steel. Corrupted by the anguish it carried, it became a demon sword of unrelenting slaughter. Under its sway, the proud kingdom of Aska was raised in a tide of crimson sacrifice. War spread across the seas, blotting out the beauty of the waters and plunging the world into darkness. At the height of this devastation, a compassionate shrine maiden stepped forward. With a single, selfless act, she gave her life to cleanse the sword's hatred and bloodlust. Grief-stricken, Asuka's 3 princes knelt before the gods, pleading that their beloved maiden's sacrifice not be in vain. Moved by their prayers, the deities of Asgard gifted each prince a radiant jewel brimming with divine power. Together, the princes used these 3 jewels to seal away the demon sword's evil. Legends, however, carry warnings. Once every 100 years, when a red full moon hangs in the sky, the seal weakens. The sword stirs, its thirst for destruction renewed, and demonic power seeps back into the world. Charles knew this tale well. He'd seen it play out in an old anime from his previous life. Gruesome though it was, he couldn't deny how riveting the story remained. Charles' stroll ed into Asuka Island's bustling market district, flanked by more than 20 companions. His heart thumped with anticipation. In a past life, he'd watched an anime about the legendary 7-star sword, a weapon said to bestow unbelievable strength on whoever wielded it. Now that he was alive again, Charles couldn't help but wonder. If he actually found the sword, would he, too, awaken its hidden power? According to what he remembered, the 7-star sword lay sealed atop a weathered altar deep within the territory of an ancient tribe. For generations, the local villagers and their witches had stood guard over the blade, keeping it hidden from any who might misuse its might. Tracking down their remote sanctuary would be no simple task. Around him, narrow lanes teemed with traders calling out their wares, carts creaked under sacks of grain, and children darted between stalls, clutching sweets their mothers had just bought. The air brimmed with the tang of salted fish, the sparkle of spices, and the promise of new opportunity. Charles paused on the wooden plank spanning the main thoroughfare and surveyed the scene. "Keep your eyes open," he said quietly to his group. "Somewhere in this sea of faces, someone knows the old legends, and maybe where the altar lies." He tightened his grip on the leather strap of his pack. No matter how well the people of Asuka Island tried to bury the past, Charles was determined to unearth it, for with that blade in his hands, everything could change. Chapter 84. Asuka Island. Charles couldn't shake thoughts of his homeland, Kame Island. It had been years since he'd last set foot there, and he wondered how much it had changed in his absence. Scanning the bustling streets of Asuka Island for news, he knew there was no better place to gather gossip than a tavern. "Let's go! Drinks on me!" Charles announced, sweeping his arm toward a narrow alley. Paul and the others exchanged amused grins, their eyes brightening at the promise of free ale. With a cheer, the 20-strong crew followed Charles through the alley and into a lively tavern. The moment they stepped inside, heads turned to watch the sizable party make its way to a cluster of empty tables. Within seconds, a burly bartender appeared, wiping his hands on a stained apron and holding out the wine list. "What'll it be, sir?" he asked in a low, steady voice. Charles leaned forward, flashing a confident smile. "Bring us your finest wines and strongest ales. No need to worry about cost. I have coin to spare." The bartender chuckled as he placed the menu on the table. "Bold request, Captain. You'll have the best we've got." Paul slapped Charles on the back. "That's the spirit, boss." A ripple of laughter and cheers ran through the crew as they settled in. Charles leaned back in his chair, ready to drink deeply and listen closely for any news of Kame Island and of the world beyond. Charles smiled faintly at the guest's remark, but didn't take it to heart. He still hadn't explained his true purpose for coming to Asuka Island to Paul. The moment the guest finished speaking, the bartender's eyes lit up. He snapped the wine list shut, hurried behind the bar, and soon returned bearing crates of bottles. "Everyone, on me!" Charles called, gesturing to the pile of wine. He rose from his stool, lifted a bottle, and before anyone could protest, tipped his head back and drained it in one gulp. "That's good. He's got good taste. Delicious." Even patrons who'd never seen Charles before broke into applause as he set down the empty bottle with a casual nod. Blushing just enough to seem modest, he waved them on, grinning. "Keep it coming. Drink up, everyone." On cue, Paul and his companions hoisted their bottles and matched Charles, draining them in a single sweep. The tavern's energy soared, revelers cheered, glasses clinked, and soon the entire room was a swirl of laughter and song. Exactly the lively welcome Charles had wanted. Amid the uproar, a voice cut through. "Brother." Charles's first glimpse of Aska Island was unlike anything he'd imagined. He'd arrived chasing rumors of a long-buried legend, and now, ship fresh in his bones, he was determined to separate fact from fiction. Spotting a burly man slumped over a wooden barrel at the harbor's edge, Charles wove through the dockworkers and gingerly tapped the stranger's broad shoulder. His words came out a little slurred. "Excuse me, I've heard talk of a legend here, a witch that's said to roam the island. Is any of it true?" The big man swiveled to face him, amusement dancing in his dark eyes. He belched and shrugged. "Legend? Where'd you pick that up? It's all talk, tales spun to lure foolish travelers ashore." He took another swig of ale. "A witch? That's just more nonsense." Charles let genuine, or expertly crafted, disappointment cross his face. "Okay, so the seven-star sword is a myth, but surely there's something to these witch stories?" The stranger's lips curled into a roguish grin. "A witch, you say? Show me one, and I'll buy you every drink you want." Charles tried not to smile at the challenge. The man's eyes gleamed as he leaned closer. "Look, there's a mountain village not far from here. Some say each generation one girl is chosen, or born, with strange powers. They call her the Island Witch. Word is, the new witch has just come into her own." Charles felt a thrill run down his spine. The island's secrets were closer than he'd thought. Oh, now all he had to do was find that village and the witch at its heart. "I've only caught a glimpse of her once from afar. At that silhouette, that face, she's breathtakingly beautiful." The burly man, his arm like an oak branch, clapped Charles on the shoulder. "Oh? You saw her for real? Does my little brother have the honor of meeting this legendary witch in person?" Charles's mouth fell open. He stammered, but the man just laughed heartily, raised his flagon, and drained it in one long pull. In that instant, Charles understood perfectly what was coming next. "Boss!" Charles called to the barkeep. "Bring us your finest wine." As the bartender hurried off, Charles silently tapped into his mind-reading skill. He sensed the burly man's thoughts coalescing around one idea. Wine, wine, and more wine. Just the right way to win the witch's favor. "You really are clueless, aren't you?" the big man jeered once the order was placed. "Special wine. That'll do it every time." Charles's hand flashed to the hilt of his sword. His blade hummed through the air, but he checked himself. This was the seven-star sword, after all. He couldn't risk a reckless swing here. "Brother," he pressed, trying to sound impatient, "you still haven't told me where that village is. I want to see her for myself." The burly man let out a booming laugh. "Soon enough, little brother, soon enough." And with that, he clapped Charles on the back once more, the promise of wine and adventure hanging between them. Charles listened as the burly man in the corner boasted, "This village is utterly cut off from the outside world. Hardly anyone ever ventures down the mountain. Only the hunters who roam the peaks know where it lies. And by chance, I happen to know its exact whereabouts." Pride filled the man's face as he leaned back, chest swollen. Charles fought the urge to slap him. Instead, he closed his eyes and touched the edge of his mind to the stranger's thoughts. In an instant, Charles saw the truth. The village lay on the island's far side, tucked behind a sheer cliff, completely hidden from casual travelers. No wonder so few knew of its existence. Charles opened his eyes. A cold frown curved his lips. Without warning, he lunged forward, his movement so sudden it seemed to erupt from the floor. The big man barely registered the strike before crashing to the ground, frothing at the mouth. Around them, the chatter paused for a heartbeat, then resumed. The patrons merely glanced over, dismissing the spectacle. Drunks passed out in taverns all the time, after all. They hadn't seen knife or fist, only another fallen fool. Charles straightened, smoothing the front of his coat, and walked back to the table where his companions waited. To the uninitiated, it looked as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Only those closest to Charles knew he had just silenced a braggart and uncovered the hidden path to the village beyond the cliff. Charles studied the fallen man, foaming at the mouth. He wasn't drunk. Paul's sheer, domineering presence had knocked him out cold. Paul caught Charles's distant expression and raised his glass as he strolled over. "Boss, what's up?" he asked softly. Charles turned to face him, lips curling in contempt as he glanced back at the unconscious giant. "Nothing," he said coolly. "You finish your drink." With a sigh, Paul shrugged and returned to the rowdy circle of tipsy crew members, glass held high. They cheered and toasted late into the night, too caught up in their revelry to notice Charles slipping away to a quiet corner. Alone, Charles reviewed what he'd seen. Thanks to his keen memory of the man's route, he already knew the way to the isolated village. The others, however, were in no state to follow. He'd have to wait until morning, when they'd be sober enough to lead them there. Putting down his own glass, Charles drained the last of his wine, set the empty bottle aside, and stretched out on a nearby bench. Tonight, he'd rest. Tomorrow, they would press on. Charles had been at sea for over a month, and the relentless rhythm of the waves had worn him down to bone-deep fatigue. His nerves were frayed, and he craved something to dull the constant hum of angst, Edie in his mind. On the dimly lit deck, he poured himself a stiff cup of rum and took a long, steadying pull, letting the warmth spread through him. For several minutes, he sat in near silence, staring out at the endless expanse of dark water. The solitude gnawed at him, thoughts of home, of what waited beyond the horizon, all tangled together in his head. But the rum's burn offered a welcome distraction, numbing the worst of his worries. Before long, a couple of crew members drifted onto the deck, attracted by the muted clink of his cup. Their easy laughter and light-hearted banter broke the spell. At first, Charles offered only a nod. Then, as they settled nearby, he found himself drawn into their conversation. Jokes were exchanged, stories shared, and for a fleeting moment, the crushing weight of his voyage lifted. The sea still roared around them, but in that circle of camaraderie, Charles felt the tension ease away, if only for a little while. Chapter 85. Asuka Island. Charles's last memory was the rim of a mug pressed to his lips, and then nothing. He'd drunk himself senseless, collapsed face first on the tavern's stout wooden table, and slept as if the world had ended. When he finally came to, a raucous clamor woke him. Sunlight slanted through the open shutters, burning his eyes. He groaned, sitting up. His head throbbed like a drum, and his mouth tasted of stale ale. Worse still, nature called in an almost painful urgency. Stumbling to his feet, Charles blinked at the scattered forms of his crew, all still passed out in drunken heaps across the floorboards. Ignoring the spinning in his skull, he found the nearest washroom and shut the door behind him. Relief hit him like a wave, and his hangover lightened by half. He splashed cold water on his face, checked his pocket watch, 6 a.m., and took a steadying breath. Time to get moving. Back out on deck, Charles spotted Paul, his first mate, curled up beneath a barrel. With a swift kick to Paul's side, he roused him. Ow! Paul bolted upright, clutching his forehead. His eyes widened as he took in Charles, alert, composed, and dressed in a clean coat. Charles strolled over to a small table where a pot of steaming tea waited. He poured himself a cup, the fragrant steam easing the last of his fog. Morning, Paul, he said evenly. Boss! Paul scrambled to his feet. You're up! Charles took a measured sip and set the cup down. At first light, I want every man on deck and ready to sail. Understood? Paul saluted, wincing at the morning light. Charles stood, drained the rest of his tea, and surveyed Asuka Island's bustling shoreline. The day had begun, and so would their next adventure. Charles's voice cut through the dawn hush. Wake up, brothers. We move out now. Paul gave Charles a quick nod, but didn't dare ask where they were headed. Orders were orders. Come on, wake up. Let's go. He strode over to Isaac and gave him a sharp kick in the ribs. Isaac shot up, blinking at Paul. Easy there. What's going on? Boss wants to leave. Now! Paul snapped. Isaac swallowed his questions, pushed himself to his feet, and went from bunk to bunk, shaking each man awake. Slowly, the 20 or so crewmen who'd slept through the night began to stir, rubbing their eyes and straightening their clothes. Boss, they're all up, Paul reported, returning to Charles's side. Charles set down his teacup and surveyed the crowded tavern room. A dozen rough-hewn tables were pushed aside to make room for the crew. Satisfied, he stood, slipped into a richly embroidered coat, and hefted a heavy pouch of coins. With a casual toss, he sent it skittering across the wooden floor toward the door. Let's move, he ordered. He stepped into the doorway, the rising sun at his back, and raised his voice. Form up. We've got a long journey ahead. Charles felt a thrill rise in his chest, and though none of the others understood why, they fell in line behind him without question. 20-odd men spilled out of the tavern and trailed him through the town, drawing curious glances from every passerby. But Charles paid them no mind. His only focus was the seven-star sword's hidden resting place, and he pressed on, guided by the memory he'd replayed over and over since yesterday. They crossed the bustling market district and soon found themselves on the edge of a deserted hollow. Charles paused to survey the terrain, confirming it matched the sketches in his mind. With a quiet nod, he chose a narrow, overgrown trail and plunged into the forest. The others hesitated at the tree line, exchanging puzzled looks. No one could see a clear path through the dense undergrowth. "What are you staring at? Move!" Paul barked from somewhere near the rear. At his shout, the men scrambled after Charles, hacking at brambles and ducking under low branches. The trail grew increasingly treacherous. Fallen logs and thorny vines slowed their progress. Charles brushed aside a tangle of leaves and snapped off a supple branch to test the ground ahead. "Boss!" Paul's voice. He rang out again, sharp with impatience. Encouraged, the others redoubled their efforts, forging deeper into the forest behind Charles, undaunted, determined, and ready for whatever lay ahead. "What are we delaying for?" Paul muttered as he sliced through a wayward branch with a single, precise stroke of his knife. The shipment should be here any minute. It had been a long morning's trek. They'd already crossed half the island and were closing in on the remote mountain village. Paul's words reminded everyone why they pushed on, no matter how rugged the paths or how thick the jungle grew. Suddenly, Charles, formerly known as Charlotte, stilled, his senses razor-sharp. In one swift motion, he raised his left hand and snatched an arrow flying at breakneck speed out of the air. "Enemy!" he warned. Paul and Isaac immediately snapped to attention, weapons at the ready. "Show yourselves," Paul demanded, scanning the dense foliage ahead. A ripple of movement danced through the underbrush some 20 meters away. The figure shifted erratically, as if blinking in and out of existence. Charles narrowed his eyes, tracking the blur until it vanished entirely, then, almost as suddenly, reappeared right beside him. Before anyone could react, Charles had the newcomer by the collar, a 17 or 18-year-old boy, wide-eyed with terror. With a deft twist, Charles hurled him face down onto the forest floor and stamped his boot firmly across the youth's back. "Talk," Charles ordered, his voice low and unyielding. "Who sent you?" Charles's boot pressed down hard on the stranger's back. The young man let out a muffled groan, but said nothing. "Boy," Charles demanded, leaning closer, "who are you? Why attack me?" The stranger glared defiantly, but remained silent. Charles rolled his eyes. "Fine, then. I guess I can't cure you." With a swift motion, Charles crouched, hooked his fingers under the man's chin, and hauled him upright in one fluid pull. At barely 1.7 meters tall, the young man dangled off the ground, kicking and twisting in Charles's grip. A cold smile curved Charles's lips. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, summoning his mind-reading gift. The air around him shimmered with faint azure light as his consciousness slipped into the struggling man's thoughts, rifling through memories as if they were an open book. The captive thrashed frantically, oblivious to the mental probe invading his mind. Behind Charles, several of the man's subordinates exchanged confused looks. "Captain," one murmured, stepping forward, "what is the boss doing?" "Why don't we just interrogate him?" one of the crew muttered. Paul shot him a sharp look. "Back off. Our boss has this." The man fell silent. Charles, his eyes cold, tapped into the boy's memories. When he'd extracted everything he needed, he gave the unsuspecting youth a dismissive flick. The boy slammed into a nearby tree, coughed up blood, and crumpled to the ground, barely moving. Even a casual blow from Charles carried lethal force. Paul watched in grim silence, his heart tightening at the sight. The boy might still be alive, but only just. Charles stepped back, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "Let's move. I found it." He'd uncovered the hidden mountain village, and more importantly, the ancient stone chamber at its center. To most, it was just another sealed ruin, but Charles, having devoured countless anime tales, recognized the significance at once. This was the seal of the seven-star sword. No one dared question him. As the crew scrambled to follow, they left the wounded boy behind and vanished into the trees, hearts pounding with excitement and dread. Charles and the others blinked as their field of vision suddenly widened. The path before them had smoothed out, flanked by carved stone walls and other unmistakable signs of human craftsmanship. They had arrived at the ancient ruins of the kingdom of Aska. In that moment, Charles knew he'd been right all along. Chapter 86, Aska Island. Who goes there? Charles had only just taken his next step when a dozen armed figures sprang up from the undergrowth all around him. He came to an abrupt halt, and so did his 20-odd companions, weapons drawn in an instant. Swords gleamed in the dawn light, flintlock barrels glinted, and a few hulking men hefted axes as though ready to fell an oak. The newcomers, clad in rough-spun tunics and leather jerkin patched with scraps of hide, formed a half-circle beyond the clearing's edge. They were villagers, or so it seemed, but their rigid stances and hard eyes betrayed a skill in combat far beyond that of mere farmers. Charles didn't flinch. He met the group's silent challenge with a small, cool smile. "Step aside," he said evenly, "or prepare to die." A palpable silence fell. Even Charles's own men didn't move, accustomed to his composure in deadly situations, and pressed closer, ready for his signal. The leader of the band, a tall man whose dirt-smudged face was framed by a tangle of dark hair, hesitated, his hand twitching toward the sword at his hip. But the cold edge in Charles's tone, the barely contained violence simmering in his stance, sent a shiver through the patrol. After long, tense seconds, the tall man's voice cracked as he spoke. Who are you? And what business have you on Aska Island?" He managed to swallow his fear into a single quavering question. All around him, faces sharpened by years of rugged mountain life showed equal uncertainty, weapons trembling in idle grips. Charles's smile widened just a fraction, though his eyes remained steely. "My name is Charles. I've come to find what was lost here. Move aside, or stay and die." A hush fell as the guards exchanged uneasy glances, sweat beading on brows they'd thought unshakable. The forest held its breath, waiting on their answer, and on Charles's next move. "Why have you come to our village?" The guard captain stood before Charles, bow notched and arrow aimed. Though he tried to sound steady, his voice trembled with unease. Charles's lips curved into a cool, confident smile. "I'm here for something hidden in the mountains behind your settlement. Anyone who interferes will die." A ripple of alarm passed through the guards. One soldier whispered, "So it really is for that thing up there." Another barked, "Quiet!" only to be met with stern glares. Rumors of wandering adventurers, some merely curious, others downright brutal, had long unsettled the village. To these men, Charles clearly fell into the latter category. The captain drew a slow breath and relaxed his bow. "Then you seek the legendary 7-star sword?" Charles inclined his head, his gaze unflinching. "Precisely. Sir, we won't stand in your way if you're after the 7-star sword," the guard captain said, voice tight with concern. "Just, please, don't harm anyone in our village." Charles raised his hands in earnest. "Of course, I'm no murderer." At that, the soldiers behind him exchanged incredulous looks. Great swordsman of blood, indeed. He hardly needed to remind them of his reputation. A low murmur ran through the ranks, but the captain nodded, relief flooding his features. "Very well, sir. You may pass." He stepped aside, sweeping an arm toward the narrow path that wound into the hills beyond. Charles wasted no time. His dark eyes glinted with determination as he strode forward, undaunted by the weary guards' warnings. He could handle whatever tricks they'd set if they could set any at all. One of the younger guards shook his head as Charles disappeared into the shadows of the crest. "Another treasure hunter chasing a ridiculous legend," he muttered. "I hope he doesn't come back empty-handed and mad." The captain gave a hollow chuckle. "If he does, at least it won't be our village suffering the consequences." Charles's pulse quickened with every step. The 7-star sword, the stuff of legends, long believed lost to time. Now he was on the brink of claiming his very first famed blade. Ahead, the trail carved a narrow cleft through the jagged rock. Beyond that lay his destiny, and the promise of power no mortal swordsmith could match. Charles grasped the demonic blade in his hand, but few in the village believed the rumors of a time traveler wielding such a sword, or that he could tame its power. Unfazed by their doubts, Charles strode purposefully toward the hill behind the settlement, Paul and a ragtag group of curious onlookers close behind him. As he marched along the dirt path, villagers peered from shuttered windows and bolted doors, convinced that locking themselves away would protect them from whatever this stranger might unleash. Only one figure remained unmoved, an elderly man seated on a low stool outside his modest home. His weathered face was expressionless, and he watched Charles's procession with quiet detachment rather than panic. Charles shot him a brief glance, but pressed on. Paul scowled at the old man's serene composure and quickened his pace to stay near Charles's side. The old man shook his head softly and murmured to himself, "Another soul consumed by the thirst for power. Sooner or later, it will be his undoing." It was high noon, and the air was heavy with the scent of cooking rice drifting from the villagers' kitchens. Yet Charles hardly seemed aware of it. His gaze was fixed on the overgrown slopes ahead, where the legendary seven-star sword was said to lie hidden, waiting for someone daring enough to claim it. Charles pushed through the last of the undergrowth for 10 minutes before the trees abruptly thinned, revealing an ancient stone altar carved into the mountainside. He led his small party forward, climbing the worn steps 2 at a time, eager to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden above. Just as he reached the top, a clear, authoritative voice rang out. "Stop right there. This is sacred ground. No one may proceed." Charles froze and looked up. Perched on the altar was a young woman with sky-blue hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. Silver ornaments twinkled in her braids, and her pale eyes, sharp as a hawk's, studied him and his companions below. A thrill ran through Charles. Had he really found the legendary witch from the old stories? Or was this some trick of his imagination, fueled by the countless anime episodes he'd binge-watched at home? His heart pounded. It had been months since he felt this kind of excitement. He squared his shoulders and called up to her. "Excuse me, witch. My name is Charles. I've journeyed here in search of treasure. I've heard there's a demon blade called the seven-star sword hidden on this mountain. Is that true?" For a moment, the witch's expression flickered. Her lips curved into a polite, guarded smile as she considered him. Then, in a calm, melodic tone, she replied, "You're chasing a myth. The seven-star sword exists only in legends. No such blade lies here. This is our altar. It's strictly forbidden to outsiders," the shrine maiden proclaimed, blocking the steps as a cluster of silver trinkets slid across the palms of the bearded stranger who was making his way down. Today, Charles had adopted the guise of a well-to-do merchant. A dyed gray beard neatly affixed under his nose and a rich brocade robe draped over his broad shoulders. He paused at the foot of the stairs and met her gaze coolly. "That won't do. The captain of the guard personally granted me passage. Why should I be turned away now?" The maiden's dark eyes flashed. Though she was young and strikingly beautiful, her resolve stood unshaken. If Charles had been anyone else, he might already have drawn his sword in frustration. "The captain's authority doesn't extend to this sacred site," she said. "My sisters and I, witches of this temple, have protected this altar for generations. Every 100 years, when the seal weakens, we alone can perform the rites to renew it." Charles let the silver pendants clink softly in his hand as he leaned closer. "What? You actually doubt the captain's word? He agreed to let me enter." A flicker of alarm crossed her face, as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The sealing ritual was her life's purpose, her order's duty since time immemorial, and she would not willingly yield it. "Even if the guard clears you, I cannot," she replied, her voice firm. "I will not allow any interference with the seal." He studied her unwavering stance and surrendered his argument to a gentler tone. "Miko," he said, using the respectful title for a shrine maiden, "I assure you I mean no harm to the altar or its enchantment. If you will but listen, I believe we can come to an understanding." Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant echo of chanting from the inner sanctum, an urgent reminder that, with each passing hour, the altar's seal drew ever closer to its century's end. Charles didn't wait for the priestess's reply. He strode purposefully toward the altar, step by deliberate step. The witch, still reeling from Charles's earlier words, hadn't even noticed his approach. Only after Charles had climbed halfway up the steps did she snap to attention. "You, stop right there. Don't come any closer," she shouted, panic flickering in her eyes. Ignoring her warning, Charles pressed on, each footfall echoing through the silent chamber. Chapter 87. Seven-Star Sword. "Miko, you can't stop me." Charles's voice rang out, echoing against the damp walls of the altar room. At 1.7 meters tall, he loomed over the tiny witch, his dark eyes alight with determination. Miko's slender hand shot out to grab his sleeve, but Charles slipped past her grasp. The moment she hesitated under his unwavering stare, he was already striding toward the chamber's far end. "No, please," she cried, but Charles paid her no mind. The room was nearly empty. Only a single stone sarcophagus rested on a raised dais. Charles approached it, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He reached out and brushed a layer of dust from the lid. The surface was cool and rough, its thick walls carved by time itself. Clearly, it had lain here undisturbed for centuries. "My prize," he whispered, fingertips tracing the intricate runes etched into the stone. Miko stumbled forward, desperation in her eyes. "Charles, don't." He ignored her. Squaring his shoulders, he pressed both hands against the lid and began to lift. The stone was dauntingly heavy. He could feel every grain shifting under his palms. For a long beat, nothing happened but the crackle of displaced dust. Then, with a grinding rumble, the sarcophagus's lid budged. A cloud of ancient particles burst free, swirling into the torchlight. Charles inhaled sharply, bracing himself for what lay within. Behind him, Miko's anguished plea trailed off into the mounting noise of stone grinding on stone. Charles didn't look back. The seven-star sword awaited, and nothing would stand in his way. "I don't want to," the witch shrieked, her eyes snapping open. But Charles didn't hesitate. He summoned every ounce of strength, gripped the heavy sarcophagus lid, and yanked it free, hurling it aside with a crash. "No!" the witch cried again, her legs buckling beneath her as she collapsed. A rancid stench filled the air, setting Charles's teeth on edge. He pressed a hand to his nose and peered into the coffin, pushing back the fetid odor. Inside lay a double-edged longsword, its blade etched with faint runes. 2 iron chains still bound it tight, chains now splintered and snapped under Charles's gaze. The metal was pitted with rust, its once luminous green sheen long since vanished. No wonder every previous seeker had overlooked it. Who would believe this corroded relic was the legendary 7-star sword? Charles leaned forward, excitement surging through him. He plunged his hand into the coffin and clenched the sword's hilt. With a mighty tug, the chains gave way. Click, followed by a soft, bell-like tinkle as the blade emerged at last. The 7-star sword was his. With a crisp snap, the chain binding it to the sarcophagus shatters. Charles stands over the battered 7-star sword, its once proud form marred by age, yet still breathtaking. He can't help but whisper, "It's perfect." "Don't!" the witch hisses. She lies sprawled on the cold stone floor, her ankles red and bruised from her frantic struggle to hold him back. Charles casts her a brief, unreadable glance. Then, as the witch watches in horror, he slips his right hand into the coffin and grips the sword's hilt. He pulls it free. In an instant, a pulse of green light ignites along the blade. The ancient runes etched into its surface flare to life, and the rust flakes away like burnt ash, revealing a razor-sharp edge that shimmers with power. The witch's eyes go wide. This is exactly as her ancestors chronicled, a demon sword that stirs to life once every century. According to the Hyuan calendar, its next awakening should not come until the year 1520. Yet here it stands, fully awakened ahead of time. Had Charles, the young man before her, somehow broken the cycle? The instant Charles lifted the blade, the bright blue sky overhead turned slate gray. In a heartbeat, dark clouds blotted out the sun, and a chill of foreboding swept across the clearing. An eerie green light pulsed from the demon knife, bathing everyone's faces in its sickly glow. Paul stood frozen, staring at his commander with reddened eyes, an unmistakable sign of the weapon's corrupting influence. Charles felt a surge of power rush through him, as though the knife had a will all its own. A sinister force coiled in his blood, and a cold, killing intent slammed into his mind like a freight train. He gripped the hilt so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Sweat beaded at his temples as he waged a silent battle for control. He had always known the demon blade was dangerous, but he hadn't expected it to fight back for mastery of his very soul. Muscles trembling, Charles could almost hear the knife's dark whispers. Strike, kill, surrender. Every instinct screamed to obey, unleash unspeakable violence. But Charles clenched his jaw and forced his spirit to rise above the blade's influence. He would not, could not, let this weapon dominate him. Drawing a steadying breath, Charles met Paul's anxious gaze and gave him a firm nod. The clouds overhead rumbled as if echoing the promise in Charles's eyes. He would wield the demon knife, but he would never be its slave. With that resolve burning in his chest, he squared his shoulders and prepared for whatever came next. Without warning, an imperial arrogance erupted from Charles, surging skyward in a blaze of red and green light. This new aura was nothing like the crimson or jet-black energies he had unleashed before. It pulsed with savage intensity, radiating outward from his form like a living storm. The moment the witch felt its crushing weight, she dropped to her knees. Foam bubbled at the corners of her mouth as she slumped forward, unconscious before she even hit the ground. Paul, Isaac, and the rest of Charles's crew didn't last any longer. How is this possible? Paul choked out, clutching at his throat. Foam spilled from his lips, and he collapsed at once, his body going limp. All around them, the oppressive aura continued to expand. A massive oak tree nearby groaned under the onslaught of power, its branches thrashing wildly. Yet the force showed no sign of abating. It swept onward toward the little town beyond the clearing. Villagers looked up in alarm. "What's happening? Help! Somebody stop it!" But before anyone could react, they too were overtaken. One by one they fell, foam at their mouths, as if an invisible hand had choked the life from them. Back at the naval outpost on the island, lookouts spied the eerie glow and sounded the alarm. Sailors scrambled to muster arms, but the moment they stepped outside, the same domineering presence bore down on them. Shouts turned into gurgles, and each man collapsed in his tracks, unconscious before reinforcements could even arrive. Silence reigned, broken only by the faint hum of Charles's relentless aura, a testament to power so absolute that nothing on the island could stand against it. "What?" Before the branch commander could even shout a warning, he clutched at his throat, foam bubbling at his lips, and collapsed to the deck. Mile upon mile offshore, fish and sea kings froze in mid-swim, their wills crushed by Charles's overwhelming presence. A cold, merciless aura had swept the entire island, an aura so potent it rendered every living thing, from the smallest minnow to the mightiest leviathan, motionless. This place wasn't some nameless rock. It housed a full naval detachment, yet now every soldier lay stunned, as if reality itself had been bent to the sword's will. Charles's eyes burned with an inhuman light, and the seven-star sword in his hand pulsed with insidious consciousness, whispering of slaughter. But on the shoreline, Shialuo, the priestess, refused to yield. Gasping for breath, she forced herself upright, her crimson gaze locking onto Charles. Though the sword's dark intelligence crept into her mind, she wouldn't surrender. With a fierce cry, she clutched her talisman and raised her free hand. Enough! 3 brilliant streaks of light flared across the emblem on her chest. A wave of pure white energy exploded outward, engulfing Charles in a blinding wash. His teeth ground together with a harsh creak, and then, as the radiance subsumed him, his vision went blank. The oppressive killing intent shattered, evaporating into the air, and the seven-star sword itself dissolved from his grasp, as though it had never been. In that stunned silence, the island seemed to release a long-held breath. The dark tide of violence had receded, leaving only the echo of what might have been. Charles crouched on the cold stone floor, panting with every ragged breath. The witch lay before him, her body twitching as faint white light flickered around his form. Daylight had long since vanished, but the ghostly glow cast surreal shadows on the broken altar stones. Heart hammering, Charles took another step forward and knelt beside her. The witch's eyes fluttered open, wide with dread, but it was too late. He reached out, gathered her slender frame in his arms, and in an instant they were gone, swallowed by that blinding radiance. When Charles opened his eyes the next morning, a throbbing headache greeted him. He glanced down and froze. He wore no clothes. Instead, a soft, smooth body, warm and unfamiliar, lay half-draped across his chest. Panic surged through him. He jerked upright, fumbling to put distance between them. That's when he noticed it, a new mark on his left wrist, the precise silhouette of the legendary seven-star sword. The long hilt, the 7 gleaming points fanning out like stars in the night sky, etched into his skin as if burned there. What had happened to him? And whose body was lying so close beside him? The answers waited just beyond the haze of his aching mind, and Charles knew he had to find them, before the day claimed him entirely. Chapter 88. Elena, what on earth is happening? Charles muttered, rubbing the intricate tattoo on his right wrist. A moment ago, he'd barely noticed the jade-skinned girl sprawled across his chest. Now, as soon as his fingers brushed the ink, a faint voice echoed in his mind. Focus your will and call it forth. He tested the command. In an instant, the air beside him shimmered, and a slender sword inscribed with glowing green runes appeared in his grasp. Charles, who had been lying prone on the cave's smooth rock floor, sprang to his feet. The witch collapsed with a dull thud, sliding free of his body and landing heavily on the stone. Staring at the weapon in awe, Charles realized it was the legendary seven-star sword, miraculously reduced to a handheld form and bound to him like a tattoo. He recalled a Shanxia drama from his former life, where cultivators' weapons bonded to their flesh as living sigils. Could this really be the same sword? And if so, how had it come into his possession? A low groan broke through his thoughts. Charles glanced down at the girl. Her pale form stirred on the ground, her dark hair fanning out like ink spilled on white marble. Only then did he notice the cavern around him, rough limestone walls streaked with damp, slick earth, the air heavy with the faint tang of blood. Stepping back, he raised the seven-star sword into a ready stance. Whatever this place was, and whoever this Elena might be, he knew one thing for certain. His life had just taken a turn into the unknown. Charles spun toward the metallic tang of blood hanging in the air. A dark puddle stained the flagstones where two bodies lay. First, he looked at the twisted, scarred form on the ground, then down at himself. Not a single cut, bruise, or drop of blood marred his skin. He should have been dying, yet he felt nothing. A sudden memory jolted through him. The moment the seven-star sword had seized his will, he'd seen 3 brilliant white flashes streaming from the witch's chest. They must have come from her 3 white crystals. Charles's eyes flicked back to the witch. Yet where the crystals once gleamed, only a cluster of white blossoms now rested on her robes. Before he could puzzle this out, the shrine maiden beside him stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she groaned, clutching her lower stomach as pain shot through her. "What happened?" she whispered, voice wavering. The witch's brows knitted together in alarm. She stared at Charles's calm, unshaken face as if expecting him to bleed any moment. "It can't be," she murmured. The maiden let out a strangled scream, drawing her hands over her eyes, then froze. A chill breeze snaked around her legs, and she realized she was naked. Panic flared as she caught Charles's gaze. "Turn away! Don't look!" she snapped. The witch snapped into action, snatching up the maiden's scattered garments from the ground and draping them around her shoulders. Charles offered a hesitant bow, his cheeks coloring slightly. With a respectful nod, he averted his eyes and stepped back, giving the 2 women space to collect themselves. Silence fell, broken only by the mistress of the shrine's uneven breathing. Charles took a deep breath, determined to unravel the mystery of the missing crystals, and why, against all logic, he remained unscathed. Charles turned his back, and the witch scrambled to gather her discarded robes, cheeks burning as she slipped hurriedly into each layer. In that same instant, the seven-star sword vanished from his hand and reappeared on his right wrist as an intricate, glowing tattoo. Even the young shrine maiden, hovering behind the witch, bowed her head and finished dressing in silence. Blushing furiously, the witch whispered, You can turn around now." Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor, her heart pounding as she tugged at the folds of her kimono. She knew exactly how compromising the situation had been, and a wave of mortification washed over her. Still, beneath her embarrassment, a curious tug at her chest urged her closer to this stranger who had intervened on her bay. Alf slowly, Charles faced her again. He took in the sight of the witch standing before him, her posture shy yet resolute, the soft lines of her robes framing an almost otherworldly grace. She was breathtaking, every movement suffused with an elegant poise that felt both delicate and powerful. At the same time, he sensed a subtle force radiating from her, one that resonated deep within him. A warm ease settled in his bones, and he realized that never before had he felt so unexpectedly at home. Charles stilled as he heard rustling above him. The witch looked up, her eyes widening the instant she recognized him. "Ah, you!" she gasped. "Why aren't you wearing any clothes?" Her cheeks flushed scarlet as she realized she'd been standing on his garments. Charles rolled his eyes. His voice was calm but firm. "Excuse me, move your feet. You're squashing my clothes." At his words, the witch glanced down. "What?" She scrambled to step back, but the sudden movement jarred her lower back. With a pained sound, she lost her balance and pitched forward, right into Charles's arms. He caught her around the waist, instinctively steadying her. Their faces hovered just inches apart. Charles's lips curved in a teasing smile. The witch's, Miko's, eyes burned with a mix of embarrassment and outrage. They froze like that for a moment, each refusing to look away. Then Charles gently lowered her to her feet, still holding her gloved hands for a second, as if anchoring her in place. He finally released her, knelt down, and began gathering his scattered clothes. With deliberate nonchalance, he stood and slipped on his shirt and trousers as though nothing unusual had happened. Miko, cheeks still blazing, peered away, both furious and flustered. Charles watched as the witch spun around in the cavern. Her cobalt hair tumbled over her shoulders, and a silver hair ornament clattered to the stone floor. He remained perfectly still, studying her every movement. He'd come this far with her. Now he would see it through. They'd shared more than words, and a responsible man didn't abandon a woman, no matter how much she resisted. Besides, wielding his 7-star sword felt a bit like getting a bonus prize, a beauty at his side. He cleared his throat, voice low but steady. "What's your name?" The witch's red eyes flashed as she turned back to him. She stared for a long moment, then lifted her chin defiantly. "Irina," she replied. "Irina, High Priestess of Aska Island." Charles nodded once. "I'm Charles Rockefeller." He sheathed his sword with a single, fluid motion. "Now that we've introduced ourselves, let's get out of here." Irina's gaze hardened, but she took a step toward him. Together, they plunged deeper into the cave, ready to face whatever awaited them. "I'm a pirate." Charles fixed Elena with a steady gaze and announced himself. The words struck her like a thunderbolt. She clasped her hands over her mouth to stifle a gasp, and tears brimmed in her eyes. How could the first person to ask after her well-being turn out to be a pirate? Charles watched Elena's tears and felt an unexpected pang in his chest, as if her sorrow echoed within him. He hated seeing her in pain. Gathering sudden resolve, he spoke with surprising firmness. "I'll look after you. From now on, you come with me." Elena blinked back her tears, startled. "We just met. You're a pirate, some scoundrel who kidnapped me," she blurted, her voice cracking. A bitter laugh escaped her. "Why would I follow someone like you, let alone become your companion?" Charles's expression hardened, but he didn't relent. "Yes, I am a pirate, and whether you come willingly or not, you're mine now. I won't let you go." The wind whipped around them, carrying the promise of adventure and of a struggle neither of them could yet imagine. Charles gave Elena no chance to struggle. In one swift motion, he seized her wrist and marched her out of the cave. "Let me go, you despicable pirate!" Elena shrieked, twisting and kicking, but Charles's grip was iron tight. She thrashed helplessly, trying to wrench free, only to find that resisting was useless. They emerged onto a narrow ledge carved into the mountainside. Elena froze when she saw the sheer drop before them. There was no path down. But Charles merely smirked. With a sudden heave, he scooped her up like a princess cradled in his arms. "Put me down!" Elena pounded his chest, panic rising in her voice. Charles's lips curled into a confident smile. Without warning, he stepped to the cliff's edge and leapt. Elena's scream cut through the air as she clutched him tight, burying her face against his shoulder. Feeling her desperation, Charles pointed his toes, found an updraft, and lifted off. Weightless, they hovered for a heartbeat before gliding safely down the mountain slope, the world rushing past beneath them. Charles eased them down until his knees touched solid ground. He held Liana gently. She was curled against him like a frightened quail, eyes squeezed shut and body trembling. He smiled and crouched beside her. "Hey, wake up. We've reached the ground." At the sound of his voice, Liana's eyelids fluttered. She opened her eyes and blinked up at him, instantly aware of his handsome profile and instantly mortified. Her cheeks blossomed crimson. In a flustered rush, she wriggled free of his arms. "Ow!" Liana tumbled onto the leaf-strewn earth. Charles's smile faded in surprise. He'd meant to set her down more carefully. Hastily, he extended a hand to help her up. For a moment, Liana froze. Then she turned away, chin up, and sniffed. Humph! Ignoring his outstretched hand, she hauled herself upright on her own. Charles couldn't suppress a teasing grin as he drew back his hand. He watched her for a heartbeat, faintly light-headed at the echo of last night's chaos, though he couldn't tell why his head felt so woozy. Elena stopped and swept her gaze across the rocky pass. In an instant, she knew exactly where she was, and without another word, she turned and walked off in one direction. Charles fell into step behind her, careful to keep just enough distance not to crowd her. As soon as Elena sensed him trailing, tears sprang to her eyes for reasons she couldn't explain. She broke into a run. Charles shortened his stride to keep pace, conscious of her confusion and her pain, but determined to give her the space she obviously needed. They emerged from the rocky outcroppings and entered a small village. Charles had not expected them to come here, yet here they were. At the settlement's edge he froze. 4 or 5 guards lay sprawled unconscious on the dirt road. Their uniforms left no doubt who they were. "This can't be real," he whispered. From the road behind him, Yeliana came hurrying, her hands shaking so badly she could hardly steady herself. She knelt beside one of the guards and fumbled at his collar. No way. Charles moved to Elena's side and knelt to examine the nearest guard. In the pale light, the answer struck him with all the force of lightning. These men hadn't been attacked, they'd simply fainted from the shock of seeing Elena. He'd felt it, too. Her presence was extraordinary, so commanding, so utterly unexpected, that it had literally knocked them senseless. Yeliana's voice trembled as she stared at Elena. "But she's a man." Elena's shoulders shook, and she swayed on her feet. Charles caught her before she could fall, steadying her with gentle hands. Around them, the village remained eerily quiet. Mourning, it seemed, the revelation of Elena's true identity. "Okay?" Charles stepped closer, crossing his arms over his chest. Amon, sprawled on the ground, lurched awake as Irina shook him by the shoulders. He let out a groan, blinking against the afternoon sun. "High Priest?" he croaked. He raised a hand to his throbbing temple and looked around in confusion. Nearby, Na knelt beside another fallen villager, gently rousing them the same way. Charles watched, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Was this really how they intended to wake everyone? Yet there was no time for second thoughts. One by one, under Irina's hands, then Liana's, and finally Elena's, each person's eyes fluttered open. At first they stared up blankly, then at Charles, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Relief washed over Elena, and she dashed into the cluster of bodies she'd helped lay out moments before. Tears sprang to her eyes as she checked pulses and brushed grass from tired hair. "You're all right. You're not hurt. You're just asleep." She kept her voice steady, though it trembled with emotion. "You'll wake fully in a few minutes. Just rest here." Charles joined Elena, offering what comfort he could. "They're all coming around," he said softly. At the sound of his voice, Elena spun on him, her eyes blazing. Charles froze, suddenly wondering what he'd done to deserve such a fierce look. Her glare held equal measures of accusation and fear, and for a moment, Charles found himself at a loss for words. Charles pressed his lips together, fighting back tears as he trudged up the mountain path behind the village. When he crested the ridge, he hollered down the slope. "Paul! Everyone over here!" Paul and the others scrambled into view, calling out, "Boss! Boss!" They'd woken on that old stone altar to find both Charles and the witch gone, and panic had nearly set them off in all directions. In the end, Paul convinced them to stay put and wait at the altar. To their relief, they now saw Charles making his way up the familiar switchbacks, the witch just behind him. Charles acknowledged their arrival with a curt nod, but didn't slow his pace. His eyes were fixed on Elena, who stood at the mouth of a weathered sarcophagus carved into the cliff face. She knelt and threw open its lid, revealing an empty interior. Dropping to her feet, Elena turned to Charles, her voice cool and unwavering. "Return the 7-star sword to me." Charles met her gaze steadily. "The sword is mine now," he said, each word measured. "I'm not giving it back." Elena's jaw quivered. She bit her lower lip, fighting emotion, and tears welled unnoticed at the corners of her eyes. Yet she said nothing more. Standing there in the fading mountain light, master and former master faced each other in heavy silence. Charles's heart lurched at the sight of Irina's tears. For a moment he froze, Then, guided by sudden instinct, he snapped his right wrist. In an instant, an emerald-green sword nearly 2 meters long materialized in his hand, the legendary 7-star sword. The moment the blade appeared, a strange hypnotic aura swept through the hall. Paul and Isaac both went pale, their eyes locked on Charles. A demon blade. Isaac burst out, unable to hide his shock. Charles offered Isaac a single composed nod, then turned his gaze to Elena. "This sword and I are one," he announced, voice steady. "Where I stand, it stands. No force can sever our bond." He lifted the 7-star sword high overhead, a peculiar light glinting between his furrowed brows. All at once, the onlookers felt an almost magnetic pull toward Charles and his blade, as though caught in a spell. Elena's breath hitched as she studied the sword's radiant edge and Charles's determined expression. In her eyes flickered a storm of awe, disbelief, and something darker, an unspoken dread at the power he now commanded. Chapter 90, Be My Woman. Charles fixed his gaze on Irina. "Come with me," he said quietly. "Be my woman." He took a step forward, standing at 1.72 meters and towering over her graceful, curvy silhouette. Irina threw back her head and laughed, sharp and scornful. "You want me to be a pirate's woman?" Charles's jaw clenched. "You don't get to choose that." His eyes were hard, unwavering. Before she could protest, he grabbed her wrist. Irina yanked and twisted her arm free, her eyes flashing with anger. "Let me go! Let me go, you bastard!" In a fierce reflex, she swung her fist at him. The punch landed on his chest with a soft thud, and to her astonishment, it barely registered. Charles's expression didn't change. He stood firm as if she'd struck a pillow. Behind them, Paul and the others exchanged bewildered looks. What had just happened? How had Charles, the quiet pirate, gone from calm to seizing Irina in an instant? Charles released her wrist and turned to face his crew. His voice was measured, final. "It's settled. We leave now, for Hive Island." He met their stunned gazes with cool determination. Without another word, he started forward, and Paul and the others hastened to fall in step behind him, leaving Irina standing alone on the deck. Everyone froze in stunned silence as the princess scooped up Elena and strode ahead. Paul blinked, finally coming to his senses, and motioned for the others to hurry after her. "Paul, what was that all about?" Isaac muttered once they'd caught up. Paul shot him a sideways glance. "Didn't you see? That witch, Elena, must be tied to our captain. He came here for her. And mark my words, when this is over, she'll be his wife. Don't let her sweet act fool you." He leaned in, lowering his voice. Isaac's eyes went wide. When he took in Isaac's dazed look, Paul sighed. "Honestly, sword practice is useless." Isaac stiffened. "Paul, what are you even talking about?" Paul shrugged and fell silent, putting more distance between them, as though he feared catching Isaac's confusion by proximity. Isaac frowned, but didn't press it, falling in step behind Charles. They passed through the waking village. Peeking out from behind their doors, villagers blinked sleep from their eyes and stared at the procession. Up front, Charles carried the high priest in his arms, while the princess, still cradling Elena, led the way onward. Charles held the high priestess Elena firmly in his arms, even as she thrashed and screamed in panic. Her robes were torn, her face pale with fear and shock. How could these people stand by and let this happen? "Stop! Let her go!" came a chorus of voices. A dozen youths, all roughly Charles's age, sprinted forward from the edge of the clearing. Some brandished rusty hoes, others swung crooked sickles. Charles said nothing. He simply tightened his grip on Elena to keep her from flailing free. "Don't! Stay back!" Elena shrieked, her voice cracking with terror. "You're no match for him. He's a demon." Her warning only fueled their rage. "Put her down! Put the demon down!" they shouted, closing ranks around Charles. One boy lunged, raising his sickle to strike. In that instant, Charles's face went calm, an unnatural calm. His eyes glowed with a fierce red and green light that seemed to shimmer in the dusty air. Without a word, a pulse of energy roared outward. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" One by one, the young attackers collapsed to the ground, sprawled in heaps around Charles's feet. Their cries echoed off the trees, then faded into groans of pain. Elena caught sight of them and froze. Her eyes widened in horror. "No! You've killed them!" She twisted free of his hold and kicked at Charles's legs, her face contorted in rage. "You monster! I'll kill you! Kill you!" She threw herself at him, hands clawing at his cheeks, nails digging into his skin. Charles's expression hardened. He raised a single finger to her lips, leaning in so close she could feel his breath. "Shut up," he whispered, his voice low and unyielding. Elena recoiled, shocked by the cold command. Around them, forest fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant groans of the fallen. Charles met her gaze, unblinking, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "You fool! They're only unconscious!" Charles seized Elena's flailing arm, trying to stop her. But before he could explain, the onlooking villagers, having witnessed him incapacitate those teenagers, misread the situation exactly as Elena had. "Hurry! Kill the intruder and protect the high priest!" Someone shouted. Old and young alike, men, women, even children, charged at Charles, brandishing kitchen knives, pitchforks, and wooden poles. Paul and the others drew their swords and formed a protective circle, eyes darting between their lord and the mob closing in. Charles frowned. To put an end to this needless conflict, he unleashed a palpable aura of dominance. It pulsed outward like a battering ram, precise and unstoppable. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" One by one, villagers collapsed to the ground as if struck by invisible force. Paul and the others exchanged glances, swallowing hard. Charles's presence, already formidable, had intensified, and its once colorless energy now shimmered with a menacing reddish-green glow. Villagers along the path froze the moment Charles emerged, cradling Yelena in his arms. They'd grown used to the swagger of a rocks pirate, but this was something else entirely, a crazed, almost enchanting force that rippled through the air. Even Charles himself felt it. His own domineering aura had shifted, sharpened into something darker. There was no time to puzzle over it now. Step by steady step, he strode past the wide-eyed peasants, Yelena utterly limp against his chest, too stunned by his earlier display to move or speak. When at last he reached the village's edge, the assembled crowd dared not draw breath. You devil!" a woman shrieked, her voice quivering. Charles allowed a slow, cruel smile to curl his lips as he glanced down at Yelena. "That's right," he said softly, voice laced with menace. "I am the devil, and if any of you try to stop me, I promise these villagers will pay with their lives." A sinister spark flared between his brows, intensifying the oppressive weight of his presence. Without another word, he turned and vanished down the road, leaving terror in his wake. Charles's words hung in the air like a challenge. Elena froze on the spot, fear coursing through her veins. Charles couldn't help but grin at her startled expression. "Ha! Come on, Elena! Snap out of it!" With that, he strode off toward the port. The path led through a thick, tangled jungle, but for Charles and his companions, it was barely an inconvenience. They pressed forward, scaled the low mountain pass, and finally emerged into the little town beyond. At first glance, the scene should have welcomed them. Narrow streets lined with shuttered shops, but it took only a moment for Charles to sense that something was terribly wrong. The town square was swarming with Navy soldiers. Scattered among them, villagers lay unconscious on the cobblestones, while onlookers rushed forward to drag the stricken to safety. "Who?" Charles began, but his voice caught in his throat. No sooner had he and his party entered the square than the Marines spotted them. The sailors snapped to attention, hands on their weapons. It was obvious from the glint of steel at their waists that these were no ordinary guards. At their head stood a tall officer clutching a young woman to his side. She trembled in his grasp, tears streaking down her cheeks. Charles's heart clenched. There was something deeply wrong here. With a sharp whistle, the officer gave the order. In unison, the Marines drew swords and muskets, leveling them at Charles and his friends. The afternoon sun glinted off polished steel as the soldiers took up battle stances. Charles exchanged a tense look with Elena. Whatever was happening in this town, it was about to turn dangerous very fast. On Charles's side, his comrades likewise gripped their weapons, poised to strike at a moment's notice without uttering a single word. Chapter 91. The Unlikely Colonel. For a tense moment, neither side made a move. Then a naval officer strode forward, a lieutenant commander, the brim of his cap low over his eyes, and a smoldering cigar clenched between his teeth. "Who are you?" the lieutenant commander barked, voice cutting through the salty air. Charles studied the officer with mild amusement, as if sizing up an old acquaintance. He leaned casually against the rail, his eyes glittering. "Heh?" he drawled. "You planning to stop me?" At once, the rest of Charles's crew, scattered 3 deep behind him, slid daggers into their hands. Their gazes flicked up to the Marines arrayed around them, dangerous and disdainful. The lieutenant commander's jaw tightened. He drew the long naval dirk at his hip, the blade glinting in the afternoon sun. "I asked you a question," he repeated, voice low but hard. Charles shrugged. The hint of a smile played at his lips. "Who do you think?" He swept an arm toward his crew. "Pirates, of course." Before the word pirate had fully left his mouth, Paul, Charles's lieutenant, snapped, "Sir, we should engage. They're pirates." At Paul's shout, the lieutenant commander barked an order. "Sound the alarm. Marines, ready yourselves for combat." Instantly, the Marines drew sabers and leveled muskets. Tension crackled like lightning across the deck, 2 forces poised on the brink of violence, one man's daring challenge against the Crown's finest. Charles tightened his grip on Elena as Major Henley strode forward, sword drawn. "Pirate, release that woman at once," the major barked. A low, mirthless laugh escaped Charles. He glanced at Elena. Her wide eyes were fixed on the navy lines, hope shining in her gaze. "Please," he thought, "you've chosen me. Why are you still begging for rescue? If they knew you were mine, they'd kill you without a second thought." He lowered Elena toward his side, but didn't loosen his hold. She tried to slip free, but Charles's reflexes were lightning fast. He caught her wrist in mid-flight. "Heh! You thought you could run?" he whispered fiercely. "You won't be escaping my grasp today." Cradling her protectively at his side, he bent close to murmur something in her ear. Color drained from Elena's cheeks, and she stared at him wordlessly. Meanwhile, more than 20 Navy Marines advanced, forming a tight circle around Charles's crew. "What's going on here?" A deep voice boomed from the ranks. Major Henley snapped to attention at the voice. "Colonel, this man is a pirate, and he's holding a woman captive." The colonel stepped forward, eyes fixed on Charles. "Is that true?" he asked, voice calm but steely. Charles met the colonel's gaze without flinching. Around them, the tension coiled like a drawn bowstring, waiting for the first move. Pirates! At the major's warning cry, the colonel darted through the cordon of soldiers to get a clear view of the intruders. Inside the makeshift ring of bayonets stood a band of pirates, and at their center was their leader. The colonel stopped dead, his heart pounding. That young man's face, he'd seen it before. The pirate captain, Charles, leaned close to a trembling girl named Elena, whispering something so faint that only she could hear. At his words, Elena's shoulders shook, and her eyes brimmed with fear. The colonel's gaze stayed fixed on Charles. He replayed every wanted bulletin he'd ever received, and suddenly it clicked. About a month ago, Navy headquarters had sent out a high-priority dispatch. They'd posted a 1 billion berry bounty on the head of the infamous swordsman Rockefeller Charles. You're Rockefeller Charles, the blood swordsman, with a bounty of 1 billion. The colonel blurted, both astonished and triumphant that he'd recognized him at last. "1 billion, he stammered, staring so hard at Charles's face that it matched perfectly with the wanted poster still fresh in his mind. "You're the pirate, Charles." No sooner had the words left his mouth than his legs gave out. He blinked once, then twice, and collapsed in a dead faint. "Call on L." The major dashed forward and caught the colonel's collapsing form just before he hit the deck. "Colonel, sir, stay with us," he cried, panic sharpening his voice. From the back of the chamber, Paul's laughter rang out. He slapped his knee in amusement. "Ha! Did you see that? The colonel just fainted dead away at the sight of Charles." A ripple of laughter followed him, and soon 6 officers were chuckling as they lowered their weapons. Charles allowed himself the slightest upward twitch of his lips. If the colonel didn't even recognize him, he'd surely believe the 1 billion belli bounty on this pirate's head was a forgery. After all, fewer and fewer people had any real knowledge of Charles since he'd set out on the grand voyage. Meanwhile, a handful of naval sentries knelt around the prone colonel, worry etched on every brow. They'd heard his words clear as day, a 1 billion belli reward for capturing this so-called pirate. No wonder the colonel had been overwhelmed. These branch officers were tasked only with patrolling their own waters. Compared to the battle-hardened elites at naval headquarters, they were woefully inexperienced. "Sir, Colonel, please, wake up," one of the sailors pleaded, shaking the officer's shoulder. But the chamber still echoed with laughter. and Charles watched impassively as they tended to their fallen leader. "I can't make this decision on my own." The Major's voice cracked, tears welling in his eyes. "If I try spinning us around again, everyone's going to get dizzy." He shook Colonel Dew frantically, but the colonel stayed limp in his chair, convincingly feigning unconsciousness. Inwardly, Colonel Dew cursed his subordinate. Didn't this fool recognize a sham when he saw one? At this moment of crisis, shouldn't the Major be hauling him to safety, rather than rattling him like a rag doll? Charles, standing a few paces away, watched the scene with barely concealed amusement. A seasoned master like him could see right through such a transparent trick. Pretending to be woozy, how utterly predictable. Sensing Charles's gaze, Colonel Dew's composure wavered. Has he seen through my act? Panic flared behind the colonel's eyes. Hastily, he gripped the Major's sleeve and gave one sharp tug. The Major, mid-cry, jolted in surprise. Then, reading the urgent look on the colonel's face, comprehension struck him like lightning. "Quick, let's move him," he cried, scrambling to lift Colonel Dew from his chair. "Take Colonel Drake back to base immediately. He's been struck by a sudden illness." The Major barked, hoisting the colonel onto his back and sprinting toward the naval station without a backward glance. The rest of the detachment, baffled by the order, froze in place. None of them had ever heard of the colonel falling ill. A handful of quick-witted sailors hesitated, then shrugged and dashed after the Major. Within moments, the entire unit had vanished from the street. Charles watched them go, shaking his head in disbelief. To rise to the rank of colonel on sheer talent, he'd have made a fine statesman. Snapping himself back to the moment, Charles seized Elena's wrist and led her briskly toward the docks. One by one, the crew sheathed their blades and followed with relieved smiles. Elena, still stunned by Charles's sudden pull, stared after the disappearing navy. Why had they withdrawn so abruptly? And that mysterious bloody swordsman, what could that mean? All of this left her little head spinning, her thoughts in complete disarray. Chapter 92, The Departure. When Charles hauled Elena aboard, she snapped awake at once. The moment she saw the shore receding, she released Irina's hand and sank to her knees on the deck, her eyes fixed on the shrinking outline of Aska Island, her home and the only place she had ever known. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "Ah! Ah!" she sobbed, her voice cracking with helpless grief. Behind her, Charles clenched his fists, guilt twisting his stomach. He had forced her from the life she'd always led, dragged her across the sea to wander unknown lands by his side. What could he say now to heal a wound that deep? He closed his eyes, fought back his own tears, and simply stood guard, unable to speak. The sailors avoided looking at her, shuffling quietly across the deck as Elena's cries echoed in the salty air. The ship steamed steadily into the open ocean until Aska Island dwindled into a distant speck and finally slipped below the horizon, leaving only the endless expanse of water and the sound of Elena's soft sobs. Suddenly, a muffled cough broke the silence. One of the crew, standing at the rail, cleared his throat and called in a low voice, "Captain, she's still crying." Charles drew in a steadying breath and turned toward Elena. His heart ached for her loss, but he knew he couldn't let her grief paralyze them both. Whatever came next, he would face it together with her. He took a step forward, prepared to speak the words that might change everything. Paul's shout rang out across the deck. "My sister-in-law's jumped into the sea again." Charles, reclining in a rocking chair, shot upright at the alarm. Without a second thought, he leapt over the rail and plunged into the cold water. Below the surface, Elena was sinking, her arms flailing as she drifted downward. Charles's heart pounded. He kicked hard, closing the gap in seconds, then wrapped his arms around her waist. Elena struggled, panic in her eyes, but Charles held on tight, careful not to jostle her too roughly and risk harming the baby she carried. They broke the surface together. Elena's breath came in ragged gasps as she beat on Charles's chest with frantic fists. "You fool! You let me almost drown!" she cried. "If you don't watch yourself, what about the child in my belly? Have you thought of that?" Charles kept his grip firm but gentle. He guided her head back until she was floating upright, treading water. "Elena, calm down," he said. "I got you. It's okay now. Let's swim back to the boat." Elena's blows slowed, but her forehead stayed creased with fury and fear. Charles held her close, shielding her from the swell, and began to kick toward the hull. Up on deck, Paul and Isaac peered over the railing. Isaac leaned close to Paul's ear. "What do you think happened between them?" he whispered, half to himself. Paul scratched his head, eyes glued to the water, where Charles and Alina were slowly making their way back. "Knowing those two," he said, "there's always more to the story than meets the eye." "He actually drove his sister-in-law, pregnant no less, to take her own life," Paul said darkly, leaning against Isaac's shoulder. "Our captain must be beside himself." Isaac only shook his head, silent. Even he found Charles's behavior hard to swallow. Despite the fact that Charles already had more than his fair share of women in his life, he couldn't keep his affairs ashore, either. And yet, irony of ironies, Charles was exceptional in every other respect. At just 20 years old, Charles had earned a reputation as one of the finest swordsmen in the world. Outside of a very few rivals, no one dared claim they could best him in combat. On top of that, he treated his crew with rare generosity, distributing the spoils evenly and devoting himself to training each man until he mastered his own strength. A captain like that was a once-in-a-lifetime find. It hadn't been an easy road to get here. For years, they'd drifted from one pirate crew to the next, slowly building a name for themselves across the Grand Line in the New World. That hard-won renown finally caught the attention of the Rock's pirates, who welcomed them into their ranks. When they pledged themselves to Charles, many of the admirals and lieutenants they'd served under before had been astonished. No one expected a young swordsman to command such fierce loyalty. Now they served in the 8th Division, the crown jewel of the Rock's pirates and the envy of every buccaneer under its flag. And still, Charles refused to silence his tongue, speaking his mind at every turn. It frustrated some, but that outspokenness was part of what made him so compelling, and, in the eyes of his crew, more than worth the trouble. Some swordsmen were so eager to join Charles's crew that they even offered to pay for the privilege. After all, Charles guaranteed each of his men a monthly stipend of 50 baileys, practically unheard of among pirate captains where failing to plunder meant going hungry. "Don't cause any trouble," Charles murmured, drawing Alina close. He rose onto his toes, scooped her into his arms, and vaulted back aboard the ship, landing lightly on deck. "Boss! Boss!" Paul and Isaac snapped to attention at the sight of their captain, but Charles ignored them. He hurried below with Alina cradled against him, determined to get her out of the cold. In his cabin, he laid her carefully on the berth. Her clothes were soaked through and clung to her shivering form. Without hesitation, he peeled the drenched garments away. "Ow, you brute!" Alina yelped, covering herself as Charles settled her under dry blankets. He pulled a chair close and sat down, determined not to leave her side until she'd warmed up, and he was sure she'd be all right. Liana buried her face beneath the blankets, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Charles set down his book, poured himself a cup of steaming water, then carried another mug over to Alina's bunk. "Come on, Alina, get up and drink this. It'll chase away the chill." It was late October, and while the sea breeze was crisp, it wasn't dangerously cold. Charles wasn't overly worried she might catch a chill. After all, this was the third time Alina had slipped off the deck the moment he looked away. Their voyage had been underway for over a week, and if he hadn't spotted her fall the first time, Arena would already be a casualty. 2 dead on board was more than enough. A muffled groan came from under the quilt. "Ugh, Charles!" He sighed, placed the mug on the small table by her bunk, and returned to his seat. The covers rustled as Alina peeked out, her eyes fixed on his back. "Why are you so eager to drown yourself by jumping off the ship?" he called over his shoulder. Alina wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her cheeks still flushed. "I'm not trying to kill myself. I just hate being cold." Charles turned, offering her a patient smile. "A cup of hot water will help more than shivering all day. Now drink up before it cools." Alina hesitated for a moment, then reached for the mug and took a careful sip. Charles watched her, relief settling over him. Once again, his overprotective routine had saved the day. Alina shrank back under the quilt the moment she heard Charles's voice behind her. She hadn't seen him turn around, and for a heartbeat, thought she might be safe, but the instant she realized he was there, her relief vanished. "You bastard! Send me home right now. I don't want to sail this cursed sea, she spat, her voice muffled by the blankets. Charles leaned against the bulkhead, one elbow propped casually as he poured himself a glass of water. He drank it slowly, never taking his eyes off her. When he set the glass down, he spoke with a lazy smile. You're not going anywhere. Like I said before, you'd better accept your fate. Once you become mine and bear my child, you'll wear my mark forever. Don't even think about escaping. Elena's eyes flashed with fury. You devil, she shrieked, throwing off the quilt to glare at him. Her hair was wild, her cheeks flushed with anger and fear. Charles shook his head, amused. Call me devil or bass. Tard all you like, he said. It won't change a thing. From this moment on, you belong to me. And just so you know, you're not the only one. At that, Elena's eyes grew impossibly large. She stared at him, stunned, as though his words had stripped away her last hope. Then, with a wail of desperation, she clutched the blankets once more and buried her head. Muffled sobs filled the cramped cabin. Outside, the ship groaned against the waves, its next destination as inescapable as the promise he had just made. Chapter 93. The Changes Wrought by the Seven-Star Sword. Cry it out. Sometimes a good cry makes you feel better, Charles said softly, though his helpless tone betrayed his impatience. Under the covers, Elena's shoulders shook with sobs, while Charles sat beside her, cradling a teacup of tea and watching her with growing concern and a fair amount of exasperation. 3 hours. 3 solid hours of nonstop weeping. He tapped the cup on the table until it rattled, then slammed it down. How long are you going to keep this up? Are you hungry or not? Elena paused mid-sob. At his blunt question, her stomach let out a mortifying rumble. She buried her face deeper in the blankets, cheeks burning. Go away, she snapped, voice muffled. Charles couldn't help a soft chuckle. Fine, he said, rising. Stepping into the kitchen, he quickly laid out some warm bread and a glass of milk before returning to her side. He placed the tray on the bed and took his seat again, still a little bossy in tone, but unmistakably protective. Here, he said, nodding toward the food. Though he teased her about her endless tears, his vigilant gaze never left Elena, determined to see her through this storm of emotion. Charles stood outside the small cabin, his heart pounding. He worried she might throw herself into the sea again if left alone. Pushing open the door, he set a plate of warm bread and a cup of milk on the bedside table. Eat something, he coaxed softly. It's been hours. You must be starving. Elena lay huddled under the thin blanket, her shoulders shaking with each sob. She didn't answer. Only a low, disgruntled rumble from her stomach betrayed that she was still there. Charles's chest tightened. If he hadn't heard that, he'd have thought she'd slipped away. He took a deep breath and knelt beside the bed. Elena, you have to think of the child, he said, voice steady but gentle. We've fixed the boat. No amount of despair will change that now. It's time to face reality. Setting the plate down, he rose to leave. Knowing she wouldn't eat if he stayed, he nudged the door closed behind him with a quiet click. Silence followed, then a soft tap. Charles cracked the door open and found Elena's tear-streaked face peering out. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her nose glistened with fresh tears. She glanced up at the food, pressed a hand to her rounded belly, and then, almost desperately, picked up the bread. With each large bite she swallowed, she chased it with a long drink of milk. Watching from the threshold, Charles allowed himself a small, relieved smile. Charles, once famed for his iron will and uncompromising demeanor, had now taken on the unlikely role of Elena's nanny, carefully watching over the child every day. When he finally sensed that Elena had settled into a peaceful slumber, he stepped out of the cabin. Boss! Boss! A handful of crew members paused in their tasks to call out greetings as he passed. Charles inclined his head in acknowledgement and continued on to the bow of the ship. There, leaning on the rail, he stared out at the endless expanse of blue. 8 years had passed since he'd first stepped into the world of One Piece. The first 5 of those years were a whirlwind of training. Day and night, he pushed himself without pause, driven by a promise he refused to break. In the 5th year, he enlisted with the legendary Rocks Pirates and truly embarked upon his destiny as a pirate. Those years at sea had brought more than adventure. His love life had exploded in every direction. 5 women had fallen deeply for him. He was now the father of a 2-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son, and another child was due any day now. By his side stood Ileana, carrying their unborn child, both of them surrounded by the warmth of family and affection he had once thought impossible. Charles closed his eyes against the sea breeze, letting these memories wash over him. A pirate, a father, a partner, and for the moment at least, Elena's devoted guardian. The journey ahead was still unwritten, but for the first time in a long, while his heart was as calm and steady as the open ocean before him. Charles, barely 20 years old, had already risen to the very pinnacle of swordsmanship. His reputation, supreme martial confidence, unrivaled armed arrogance, absolute domination, preceded him wherever he went. A Herculean physique combined with lightning-quick technique made him virtually unbeatable. In the world of One Piece, only a handful might dare to claim they could stand against him, and none had proven it. And yet, despite his fame and power, Charles felt a hollow ache in his heart, as though something vital had been lost. Was this the invincible loneliness he'd heard whispered about? No, it couldn't be. He still counted every bounty he'd claimed. He still cared about his next victory. Nothing else mattered. He knew better than most just how few truly formidable pirates there were. Locks, captain of the Rocks Pirates, Edward Whitebeard Newgate, commander of the 1st Division, Shiki the Golden Lion, captain of the 2nd Division, and even the likes of Fleet Admiral Sengoku, Vice Admiral Garp, and General Steelbone Sora. And beyond them, legends like Gol D Roger and Dark King Silver's Rayleigh of the Roger Pirates. None of them posed a genuine threat to him. To call himself invincible might be bragging, but Charles knew his strength gave him more than enough protection. His chest heaved as he stared up at the wide-open sky. Frustration and fury swirled inside him until he could hold back no longer. With a roar that echoed across the deck, Charles unleashed every ounce of restless energy pent up in his soul. Charles's roar echoed across the deck, drawing startled glances from the crew. No one understood what had come over him, until a brilliant green longsword materialized in his hand. Lightning crackled along its blade, bathing his surroundings in an otherworldly glow. Ha! Charles gripped the 7-star sword with both hands and swung it toward the open ocean. In an instant, a blinding green arc of energy shot upward, soaring like a second sun, before plunging back down in a columnar strike that cleaved through the waves. The shockwave rolled across the water, churning the sea into whitecaps. A stunned silence fell over the sailors. Even the seasoned veterans on deck gaped as the sword's radiance faded, revealing nothing but the calm, newly sliced sea. Paul and the others, Charles's loyal followers, exchanged awed whispers. By the sea gods, he's gotten stronger again. Charles himself stood frozen for a heartbeat, eyes wide as he surveyed the immense power he had just unleashed. He knew his own limits, and this was far beyond them. Raising the 7-star sword, he traced his fingertips over the engraving of the Big Dipper near the hilt. "Could it be you awakening?" he murmured, voice low but fierce. The sword hummed in response, its emerald light pulsing in time with Charles's racing heartbeat. All around him, the crew stiffened in reverence. Their captain, no longer merely Charles the swordsman, had become something more. And as the wind tugged at his hair, Charles felt the first stirrings of a power he could scarcely comprehend. Charles swung his sword, expecting the usual white blade of energy, but what flew forth was a vivid green. He frowned in confusion. He'd been certain the aura was white moments ago. Could this be the spirit of the 7-star sword? Focusing his will, Charles summoned his armament domination once more. Instead of the deep black he knew so well, the enveloping energy shimmered in emerald and onyx, a pale green sheen rippling over the dark surface. In an instant, the aura cloaked his entire body. He caught his reflection in the placid sea and froze. The man staring back was tinged green from head to toe. "No way," he whispered. He dashed ashore in search of a mirror. Sure enough, the black domination armor now carried a faint, almost ghostly green layer. His heart raced. It really is the 7-star sword transformation. Yet with astonishment came exhilaration. His armament domination felt dramatically strong, and more solid, as if he'd saved himself months of grueling training. After all, the quickest way to temper one's domination was in real combat, or by shattering mountains. Charles had stumbled upon the deserted island almost by accident during his boxing regimen. Intrigued by its isolation, he spent the next 3 months training his fists until each thunderous strike could level a mountain. By the time he left the island, 4 once towering peaks lay in rubble. Despite this raw power, Charles knew he was still weak in armed combat. He deliberately set aside weapons training in favor of honing his swordsmanship, finding blade work more engaging than the painfully slow progress of armed domineering, as the old masters called it. Under that banner, he had broken through to the rank of great swordsman, mastering every form and flourish the sword arts demanded. Yet that very success left him restless. Armed domineering, grappling with heavy weapons, controlling their every swing, remained his most stubborn shortcoming. Determined to conquer it, he sheathed his sword once more and resolved to immerse himself in weapon-based techniques. There was just one problem. He didn't have a suitable weapon at hand. Rumor spoke of the 7-star sword, a blade said to balance weight and agility perfectly, an ideal tool for learning the art of armed domineering. Without it, his new training would stall. And so Charles set off once again, this time in search of the legendary 7-star sword, his ambitions momentarily deferred, but his resolve stronger than ever. Chapter 94. The Red Earl's Moment to Shine. Charles had just claimed the 7-star sword, but the real trial was only beginning. The Battle of the Valley of the Gods loomed ahead, and he knew there was no time to waste. He had to cultivate his martial sovereign spirit at once. Power was his only priority. With decisive care, he shed his Dominator armor and faced the full-length mirror. Golden hair framed a sharply handsome face, every feature defined by confidence. Standing just under 1.9 meters tall, his frame combined raw strength with athlete's grace. Muscles rippled beneath his skin, the very picture of controlled power. Add to that the might of his spirit, and Charles felt almost flawless. A satisfied smile curved his lips as he appraised himself. Then, without warning, a blade of spiritual energy slashed through the air, its crack loud enough to rouse suspicion that an entire naval fleet was arriving. But it was only a test stroke, a single demonstration of the sword's balance and his growing prowess. Behind the mirror, Paul and Isaac exchanged glances of pure exasperation. First, he unleashes a shockwave that could have drawn the attention of every patrol ship in the sea, and then he comes strutting back to admire his reflection like a peacock. "What has gotten into him?" Paul muttered. "Since when did the Earl turn into such a vain show-off?" Isaac sighed, wondering if the driven, determined Charles he knew still lurked somewhere beneath this new, over-the-top swagger. Paul and Isaac exchanged uneasy glances. Could the sudden surge of power have overwhelmed their boss? A brilliant sun hung high in the sky as Charles lounged on the bow, the salty breeze tugging at his hair. Beside him stood Elena, arms crossed, her eyes a mixture of anger and resignation. It had been over 2 weeks since she'd thrown herself into the sea, desperate to force Charles to let her return home. But each time she tried to follow through, he intercepted her quietly, reminding her, gently but firmly, of the child growing inside her. That single, unchanging argument drained her will to die, leaving her trapped under his watchful gaze. Now she stood there, furious yet powerless. Charles paid little attention to her glare. In his hand was a crumpled newspaper, actually a month-old issue he'd picked up from a street vendor. He flipped through it until a particular photograph made him pause. He leaned forward, squinting at the image as a dozen questions buzzed through his mind. Charles leaned back in his captain's chair and let out a low chuckle. The world government's latest bounty bulletin flashed on the holoscreen before him. Red Earl Patrick Redfield, better known as the Red Earl, now carried a whopping 1.8 billion berry price tag. The report didn't pull any punches. Redfield had violently forced his way through the government's secret passage into the New World, cutting down countless Marines and world government agents without mercy. Such slaughter was beyond heinous, leaving no doubt that his crimes, whether measured by bloodshed or sheer audacity, were unforgivable. Charles shook his head in amused disbelief. Of course the Red Earl was furious. His own bounty had just been outstripped by Charles's ever-rising number. It seemed the Earl was determined to reclaim the spotlight at any cost, even if it meant a brazen attack on the world government itself. After all, few pirates could claim to have breached that impenetrable corridor into the New World. A month ago, on a windswept islet far from any major trade route, the Red Earl had stood alone on a rocky bluff overlooking the sea. His complexion was as pale as moonlight, and in his gloved hand he held the very bounty order that now glowed on Charles's screen. A cruel smile curved his lips. "Heh, heh," he'd whispered to himself. "You think you can crush me? Not a chance. Just you wait. Once I perfect my new domineering entanglement technique, we'll settle this score properly." With that, he slipped the bounty notice into his coat and strode away, the wind tugging at his crimson cloak like a loyal standard. Now Charles sat aboard his own ship, watching that same document circulate through Navy headquarters, and he knew, more than ever, that a clash between him and the Red Earl was inevitable. When that day came, neither man would show mercy. Charles, better known in pirate circles as the Red Earl, strode toward the island's center, his stomach growling for something to eat. He paused for a moment, recalling his most recent exploit. "The world government really isn't to be underestimated," he murmured. Earlier that day, determined to raise his own bounty, Charles had stormed a hidden world government passage on Murloc Island, their secret gateway to the New World. With his reputation eclipsed by another pirate, he'd planned a bold show of force to earn himself headlines. No sooner had he broken in than naval troops, led by a vice admiral, surrounded him. The Red Earl simply smiled. In a matter of heartbeats, he cut down the admiral and every soldier in his path. When the echoes of steel faded, he felt no stir of Haki or any other defense. The passage lay undefended. Calm as ever, Charles continued through the corridor, certain he'd slipped past unnoticed. But as he stepped into the antechamber, a sudden, oppressive pressure seized him. It wasn't the roar of cannons or the clang of armor. It was something far more sinister. A chill swept through his bones as an invisible, tyrannical force locked onto his very spirit and body. Charles froze. He had bested vice admirals before, yet this presence felt like a vice tightening around his soul. Somewhere beyond the next door, something, was challenging him. And for the first time that day, the Red Earl felt the thrill of real danger. Charles, known far and wide as the Red Earl, saw those 5 auras before he felt them. They weren't as oppressive as his own, but they brimmed with deadly intent. In an instant, he recognized them for who they were, masked operatives of CP0, the Celestial Dragon's secret shield. Without hesitation, Charles drew his blade and struck. His sword danced with lightning speed, carving arcs through the air that should have reduced ordinary foes to dust. Yet these agents were anything but ordinary. One by one, they recovered from his initial onslaught, exchanged glances, and closed ranks. Soon the Red Earl found himself besieged on all sides. At first, Charles parried every blow, his movements a blur of steel and precision. Still, 5 skilled CPO operatives, 2 of whom wielded the terrifying powers of devil fruits, pressed him relentlessly, turning his defense into an uphill battle. Their combined pressure felt like a storm battering a lone cliffside. Even his extraordinary speed began to feel insufficient. The duel stretched from morning past noon into evening. Each clash of blades, each pulse of Haki, rang through the air like thunder. The CP0 agents, though shaken by Charles's ferocity, stayed resolute, determined to wear him down. And as the sun dipped low, Charles felt exhaustion creep into his bones. He knew their aim was to sap his strength until he broke, consumed, alone, and at their mercy. Breathing heavily, the Red Earl steadied himself for what he sensed was the final wave. With 2 devil fruit users among his foes, there would be no easy victory. Yet retreat was not in his nature. Standing firm amid the chaos, Charles readied his blade, resolved that even if his body failed, his will would not. Red Earl didn't suffer a decisive blow. With a single sweeping strike of his sword, he dove into the sea and vanished beneath the waves. As he swam, he cursed himself for resorting to dishonorable tactics, 5 against 1, when he was more than capable of facing a lone opponent. The memory of Charles, so bold, so unyielding, flashed unbidden through his mind, and for a moment the Red Earl missed the boy. He shook off the thought and pressed on. Back on shore, a CP0 agent broke into a run, intent on pursuing the fleeing pirate lord, only to be halted by his superior. "Let him go," the officer ordered. Always flat. He belongs in the New World, squaring off against those pirates. No one dared argue. Corpses and shell-cratered earth were all that remained of the skirmish. The agents exchanged glances, then fell into formation and withdrew. Red Earl fought the current, aiming for a lone ship rounding the Cape, a merchant vessel bound for the world government's trade routes. Leaping aboard, he cut down anyone who dared oppose him. Afterward, the survivors fell silent and compliant. For the next few days, he rested in a hidden hold, his wounds knitting shut beneath careful ministrations. Though his body was whole again, his face stayed surprisingly pale, haunted perhaps by thoughts of the boy named Charles. Charles, the Red Earl, let his ship drift into the calm waters surrounding a small, uninhabited island. He unfolded the freshly issued bounty notice in his hand, studied the hefty reward posted at the top, then allowed a slow smile to creep across his face. With a delicate tap on the paper, he murmured to himself, "Not bad at all." He cleared his throat, dropped the notice to the deck, and stepped ashore. He needed a few days' rest to heal his wounds. He had no desire to spend that time locked away in his cabin practicing swordplay. More importantly, the world now knew his name, and the world government was seething. Since its founding, no pirate had ever dared to brazenly flaunt defiance so close to the government's own doorstep. Charles was the first. Worse still, the Navy's headquarters seethed with fury at the news that one of their rear admirals, a hero in their eyes, had fallen by Charles's hand. A branch-level rear admiral, perhaps, but a rear admiral nonetheless. And he'd been taken so casually, as though he were nothing more than prey. As Charles strode toward the interior of the tiny isle, the salty breeze tugged at his coat. For the next few days, he would rest, recover, and plan his next move, safe, if only temporarily, from the world government's wrath. Chapter 95. Locke's Call. Navy headquarters was reeling. With the Red Earl's sudden death, the Navy's backbone had been shattered. Every officer and sailor felt the shock. In his office, Admiral Cyborg Kong slammed his fist on the table. "Increase the bounty on that rebel," he roared. "Make it 1.8 billion. Within minutes, the proclamation had raced across the Grand Line and every trade route in the world. Newspapers and bulletin boards flashed the staggering reward, 1.8 billion berries for the capture, or death, of the man who had brazenly stormed the world government's front gate and struck them a humiliating blow. Just then, the heavy doors burst open. A young orderly stood at rigid attention. "Sir, urgent report." Cyborg Kong turned. "What is it?" "The great swordsman of blood has appeared," the orderly panted. "The Aska Island Naval Detachment has located him. Charles." "Charles?" Kong's eyes widened. "Charles Garrison, the boy who vanished a month ago?" The orderly bowed and held out a sealed dispatch from Colonel Sadhu of the Aska Island branch. With one decisive motion, Kong tore it open and extracted a single photograph. Under the flickering lamplight, the image came into focus. A lithe young swordsman, steel-blue eyes blazing with defiance, dark hair tousled by the sea breeze. Cyborg Kong studied it for a long moment, his expression hardening. "So he's alive," he muttered, "and stronger than ever." He folded the photograph and slipped it into his coat. "Prepare the fleet," he ordered. "We sail for Aska Island at dawn. No mistakes." The Admiral's voice echoed through the chamber, carrying a promise of vengeance and a dawning realization that this battle was far from over. In the holoframe, Charles has a young woman pressed against him, her arms flailing as she tries to break free. Steelbone Kong, the cyborg warlord, watches in silent fury. Intelligence files have long whispered of Charles's licentious appetites, and now they confirm the worst. His 8th Squadron has all but become a floating harem, more than half its female crew rendered powerless under his command. Hearing those damning reports, Kong's steel-clad fist slams the desk. "That filthy pirate," he growls. "Dispatch every tracker we have. I want Charles's location, now." His aide recoils at the roar but manages a nod. "Yes, Commander." The trembling messenger hurries out. Kong wipes a bead of hydraulic fluid from his brow and, still simmering, turns back to the data terminal. A sharp blue breaks the quiet of the ship's gym. Charles, halfway through a set of heavy iron curls, freezes. He sets the barbell down, brushes sweat from his forehead, and strides over to the beeping comm bug to see who's calling. Charles stared at the caller ID. Rocks. Without a second thought, he swiped to answer. "Hey, Captain Rocks. What's up?" A booming laugh crackled through the handset. "Ha! Ha! Ha! Charles! Are you all right?" Charles's brow furrowed. I'm on my way back right now. Everything okay? Of course I'm fine, Rox chuckled. But I couldn't help noticing you've been gone from Hive Island for nearly 3 months, and not a single call home. Have you forgotten your captain? The laughter that followed felt almost menacing. Charles cleared his throat. Captain Rox, is that really why you rang me? Silence, then more laughter. That's only part of it. I miss you, you know. You're my finest subordinate. A captain always keeps tabs on his crew. Charles tugged at his collar, unease prickling at his neck. Right, I appreciate the concern. Anything else? From the other end came a slow, sinister chuckle. Nope, that's all for now. Just wanted to remind you who's in charge, and make sure you haven't forgotten it. Charles forced a laugh of his own. Message received, Captain. I'll see you soon. He hung up, heart pounding. Across the ocean on the great throne at Hive Island, Captain Rox settled back, a dark grin playing on his lips. The game, it seemed, had only just begun. Charles pressed the transmitter, and a ackling voice answered him. You guessed right, there is something out there, but it doesn't concern you yet. Someday, you may have to act. Locke's words were tinted with uncertainty, and Charles frowned. What do you mean? What's happening? A low, manic chuckle rattled the speaker. Ha! You don't need the details now. Just know this. A great war is coming. A war that will change the world, win or lose. Mwah! Charles's heart skipped a beat. A war? Exactly. Locke's grin seemed to widen through the line. By the way, how soon can you reach Beehive Island? Charles glanced at his map. I'm almost through the Shampoo Lands. If all goes well, I'll be on Beehive Island in about 2 months. Good, Locke said, his voice suddenly calm. I just wanted to be sure you're still alive. We'll speak again soon. He laughed once more, then the sound of the line clicking broke the connection. Charles lowered the phone, staring at it as the dial tone hummed softly. A chill ran down his spine. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin preparing for the war Locke had foretold. Charles didn't need to be told twice. Locke was gearing up for the Battle of the Valley of Gods. What he couldn't understand was Locke's motive. What treasure or power lay hidden in that valley that made him so eager for war? The question nagged at Charles's mind, but no answer came. Frustrated and nursing a pounding headache, he threw himself back into his training, determined to carve out every ounce of strength he could before that fateful clash. Beehive Island. Locke hung up the phone and lowered his gaze in deep thought. He wasn't worried that Charles might try to slip away. Far from it. Charles's wife and child still lived on Beehive, and Locke knew his willpower well enough to be confident he wouldn't abandon his family. When Charles had first come to him with his plan, Locke had met it with disbelief. Why would a rising warrior risk everything and take only a handful of men? But after 3 years by Charles's side, Locke had come to know his true character. Steadfast, honor-bound, utterly devoted to those he loved. That realization had made Locke's decision easy. He had granted Charles's request without reservation, and even extended him a gift. Reaching behind his throne, Locke produced a modest wooden box. He set it on the armrest, slid back the lid, and revealed a single shimmering devil fruit nestled in straw. This, Locke said quietly, his voice tinged with both respect and expectation, is your ticket to the Valley of Gods. Use it well. Charles looked up at him, heart pounding. Whatever lay ahead, he now had the means to meet it. And somewhere in that distant valley, the answer to Locke's obsession awaited. Locke sat atop his carved obsidian throne in the great hall, staring intently at the purple-red devil fruit nestled in the wooden box before him. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. So he's been hiding this fruit all along, he murmured. Only today does he finally confess. Hey, Rox, pacing before the dais, stopped abruptly and called out, Captain! From the far end of the hall, an elderly man in a sharp suit emerged, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor. Deliver this devil fruit to Charles, he ordered coolly, and make sure he hands over the map in exchange. Locke gave a single nod. With a swift motion, he tossed the box across the chamber. Do it! Rox saluted crisply, caught the box in both hands, and bowed low. Yes, Captain. Cradling the precious fruit, the old man turned and strode toward the gate. As the doors swung shut behind him, the hall fell silent. Then Locke threw back his head and erupted into mirth. Wah! Soon this world will belong to me. Wah! Meanwhile, on a small, uncharted island, Clara shaded her eyes as she watched Charles kneel by a campfire, inspecting a rolled-up map. The sea breeze tousled his dark hair, and his confident smirk told her he already had a plan. She bit her lip. "Charles, do you really think Locks will agree to the deal?" He looked up, tucking the map into his satchel. "Absolutely," he said. "He's desperate to learn what our map reveals. If he lets this chance slip, he might wait 40 years for another, if he lives that long." Clara exhaled, a laugh of relief escaping her. "You're right, he won't pass it up." Charles stood and slung the satchel over his shoulder. "Then there's no time to lose. Let's finish what we started." Together, they disappeared into the swaying jungle, ready to confront their fate, devil fruit and map in hand. Chapter 96, The Chambord Islands. "We've really gone and offended Rocks this time," Hayton Muchin muttered, glancing at his younger brother. "Once we secure the devil fruit, we cut ties with the Rocks pirates and set course straight for Wano." "Understood, sister," Hayton Chanwan replied with a firm nod. Charles stared in awe at the misty outline of land rising from the sea. Could this really be the Chambord Islands? Beside him, Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with wonder. It had been 3 days since their last message from Rocks, and now their ship pulled into the legendary Chambord archipelago. They needed to let the hull dry and apply a new protective coating, essential after nearly 2 months of non-stop sailing. At the outset of the voyage, Charles had promised his crew a 2-day shore leave here, a chance to stretch their legs and explore. Finally, that promise was coming true. Anchoring in the calm, emerald waters, the crew prepared to disembark. The island stood before them like a dream. Lush jungles, soaring cliffs, and beaches of pale, powdery sand. For Charles and his crew, this would be a brief respite, and perhaps the key to unlocking the next chapter of their adventure. Charles had spent the voyage dozing beneath the deck's skylight, only stirring briefly whenever they made a quick stop to restock food or fresh water. Now, at last, it was time to stretch his legs. "Land ho!" shouted the lookout. The cutter eased to a halt in shallows lapped by pale green waves. Charles was the first to leap onto the shore, boots splashing through the shallow surf. As he scrambled up the beach, his gaze locked on a number carved into the bark of a massive mangrove tree. Island 8. In his mind, he replayed Professor Marlowe's lecture on the Chambord archipelago, better known among sailors as the Soap Bubble Islands. Situated just off the red clay continent in the heart of the Grand Route, these isles are nothing like ordinary land masses. Their terrain is woven from the tangled roots of towering trees, and from the ground itself, effervescent bubbles continuously seep into the air. Superstitious mariners whisper that this place is both the island of failure and the island of fresh starts, for its shifting roots can strand the unwary as easily as they offer a new beginning. Dominating the archipelago is the colossal Algerman mangrove, reputedly the largest of its kind in the world. Its aerial roots rise from the waterline like a forest of thick, black columns. Because these roots are perpetually bathed in brackish tides, they expel a special golden-hued resin whenever they breathe, a shimmering secretion that coats the soil and gives the islands their otherworldly glow. Charles paused to catch his breath, the resin's sweet tang in his nostrils. Ahead lay tangled mangrove groves, hidden creeks, and who knew what surprises. Island 8 was calling, and whatever mysteries it held, Charles was determined to unravel them. The resin swells with air, forming giant spheres that drift up into the sky. But these bubbles only remain stable in the unique climate of the Alquizman mangrove. Step beyond the weather patterns of the Chambord archipelago, and the resinous shells rupture in spectacular explosions, their power abruptly cut off. Yet within the islands themselves, bubble culture thrives. Bubble-powered cars glide through the streets, Ferris wheels spin on vast translucent globes, and homes perch atop floating orbs. From corner to corner of Chambord, life revolves around these shimmering spheres. The archipelago itself consists of 79 colossal mangrove trees, each one supporting its own towns, docks, and workshops. Locals simply refer to the entire chain as the Chambord archipelago and organize its islands by number. 1 to 29, the black market, human trafficking dens, auction houses, and outlaw enclaves. 30 to 39, recreational zones, bubble parks, amusement grounds, and thrill rides. 40 to 49, commerce and culture. Markets filled with exotic goods, artisan shops, and sightseeing platforms. 50 to 59. Industry, shipyards, resin coating ateliers, and repair yards. 60 to 69. Authority, naval outposts, government checkpoints, and customs terminals. 70 to 79. Hospitality, hotels, guest houses, taverns, and inns catering to every taste. Because the Chambord Archipelago is the only portal to the New World, it draws an eclectic and often dangerous crowd. Pirates, traders, and bounty hunters all converge here, chasing fortune and fame among the floating bubbles and mangrove giants. The island was rife with corruption. Human traffickers and bounty hunters plied their trade openly, buying and selling captives, while mermen and murlocs were quietly tolerated. In truth, Charles couldn't have cared less about any of it, so long as no one crossed him or spoiled his mood. When the ship anchored, Charles leapt ashore as the gangplank was lowered. From the deck of the vessel, Elena descended with unhurried grace, and Charles felt his pulse quicken. "Fair lady," he called, dropping into a gallant bow. He swept one arm behind him and extended the other in invitation. "May I have the honor of guiding you around the island?" Elena paused, regarding Charles with an arched brow. His sudden display of courtesy seemed almost comical. With a single, disdainful snort, she brushed past him and strode purposefully toward the heart of the settlement. Charles froze, hands still outstretched, cheeks burning with embarrassment. Around him, Paul, Isaac, and the rest of the crew, over 20 strong, shifted uncomfortably, itching to laugh but too polite to do so. He shot them a fierce glare and, regaining his composure, hurried to catch up with Elena. Charles couldn't bear the thought of letting someone as beautiful as Irina wander alone on Island No. 8, an illegal outpost where a single careless move could land you in serious trouble. He hurried to catch up. "Elena, why don't we swing by Island number 30? I've heard they sell those famous Chambord soap bubbles there." Elena sniffed dismissively. "And why exactly would I go there with you? Mind your own business." With that, she turned on her heel and strode straight for the island's central plaza. Charles stiffened, shooting a sharp look at Paul, who had steered their boat to this shore. Paul, trailing behind him, tilted his head in confusion. "Boss?" he murmured to Isaac. Isaac simply shrugged, equally clueless. Shaking off his momentary frustration, Charles followed Elena through the narrow, winding streets. Yuliana, who'd remained silent at their arrival, walked beside him with wide-eyed wonder, her curious gaze marking her clearly as a newcomer. Already, half a dozen locals had paused their daily routines to stare at Irina's striking presence. Charles's jaw tightened. He vowed silently that no one on this lawless island would dare trouble her. Charles never asked for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. He grabbed Elena's arm and leaned close, urgency in his eyes. "Elena, someone's tailing us. Let's move before they realize we know." Elena spun around, scanning the quiet hall. No one paid them any mind. She jabbed a finger at Charles's chest. "Oh, please, you're the one staring at me. If anyone's acting strange, it's you." He winced, caught red-handed. She was right. He had been distracted. He forced a crooked grin. "Okay, fine, but I swear I saw movement back there. Come on." They hurried down the corridor, weaving between merchants and guards. Unbeknownst to them, 3 figures lingered in the shadows. The largest man, ruddy-cheeked and greasy-haired, watched Elena with a hungry gleam in his eye. "So what?" he sneered. "A kid can't threaten us. But her? Send her to the auction block, and she'll fetch a small fortune." His companions stayed silent, sharing the same greedy look. At last the leader whispered, "Enough. Keep them in sight. We'll strike when the time is right." With that, the trio melted back into the gloom, shadows among the shadows, trailing Charles and Elena every step of the way. I've discovered that we're not the only ones after this prey. Our rivals have their eyes on them, too. The boss with the ruddy complexion raised his hands in a placating gesture and fell into step behind Charles, all under Charles's steely, watchful glare. News that other crews were closing in sent a chill across Charles's face. This hunt was going to be bloodier than he'd anticipated. He glanced over his shoulder at Paul and arched an eyebrow. Paul met his look, understood instantly, and quietly signaled to a few of their men. They melted into the shadows, readying their weapons and straightening their coats as if preparing for a performance, silent, precise, and deadly. Isaac, ever loyal, stayed at Charles's side, matching his stride without a word. Together, they advanced into the night, every nerve alert for the coming confrontation. Chapter 97. Charles trailed Aunt Alina through the bustling docks, unaware that a pair of curious eyes followed them from the shadows. She wandered from boat to boat, completely absorbed in the scene. He quickened his pace to stay beside her. "My dear Aunt Alina," he said brightly, "we've already explored this harbor. Why don't we sail on to islands 30 through 40? I hear they're far more exciting." Elena snorted and planted her feet. "I like it here," she insisted, leaning against a weathered piling and watching the fishing boats bob in the tide. Charles forced a smile, but inside he was tense. With him by her side, real danger was unlikely, but he worried most about her unborn daughter, Irina. At nearly 2 months along, one sudden fright could trigger a miscarriage. The very thought made his heart pound. Family mattered to Charles above all else, and he wouldn't forgive himself if anything happened to his aunt or her baby. Determined to keep her moving, he suggested they visit island number 12 next. There, the market was alive with colorful spices and hand-woven fabrics. Elena glanced at the stalls, but only for a moment. Undeterred, Charles steered her to island number 19, famed for its street food vendors. She sampled a skewer or two, yet as soon as she'd tasted them, she wandered off again. Finally, they arrived at island number 27. A row of ornate lanterns caught Alina's eye, and she came to a halt, staring at the delicate glasswork as though under a spell. Charles's patience snapped. He stepped directly into her path. "That's enough," he said firmly. "We're leaving this island, right now." Elena shot him a furious look, but Charles stood his ground. No amount of stubbornness would put her, or precious little Irina, in harm's way today. Charles grabbed Elena's arm, his voice low but urgent. "Don't be stubborn. You have no idea where you're going. It's dangerous. This island isn't a place for you." Elena gave him a cool, detached look and gently shook him off. Without a word, she turned and began striding toward Dock 5 on island. Charles stared after her, frustration twisting in his gut. He'd tried every trick in the book to keep her safe, especially now, with her condition, and nothing had worked. He couldn't let her wander into trouble by herself. Nearby, Paul and Isaac exchanged glances. Charles had sent them ahead to scout for any hidden threats along the shoreline. Seeing Elena step onto the creaking wooden planks of Dock 5, he realized there was no turning back. If he was going to protect her, he'd have to confront whatever lay ahead. With a decisive flick, Charles tore off the disguising beard and tossed aside his straw hat. The sun glinted off the navy insignias embroidered on Paul's and Isaac's jackets. They'd called in a cutter from headquarters for backup, so they weren't alone. He squared his shoulders, no longer hiding his face, and fell into step beside Elena. "Hey!" he called out, straining to keep pace. "Wait up! Why didn't you bring your bamboo hat?" Elena chided Charles with a playful frown. "Since you're so eager to explore, you might regret it without some shade." He merely shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and then, much to Elena's surprise, strode confidently toward the island's town center. She stamped her foot in mock annoyance, but immediately hurried to keep up. Charles cut a striking figure, tall and lean, with dark brows that arched in amusement whenever he looked around. Beside him, Elena Liana carried herself with a warm, almost maternal grace. Together, they attracted every eye in the crowded street, some onlookers gazing with envy at their easy companionship, others smirking with curiosity, and a few more casting furtive, covetous glances. Charles met each look with cool indifference. To him, it was all part of the day's adventure. Elena, by contrast, was brimming with excitement. Born on the remote Aska Island, she had never seen anything like the bustling markets of the Chambord Islands. Where her home small town offered only a handful of stalls, here the air pulsed with life. Colorful banners snapped in the sea breeze, vendors hawked exotic spices and rare fabrics, and the chatter of haggling filled every alley. Elena's eyes shone as she took in the scene, her heart racing at each new discovery. At last, she spotted a stall strung with delicate glass pendants that caught the sunlight like droplets of liquid color. "Look at those," she breathed. Without hesitation, she dug into Charles's leather pouch and pulled out a handful of copper Bailey coins. The stall-keeper's eyes lit up at the payment, and Elena carefully selected the prettiest pendant, turning to Charles with a triumphant grin. He only shook his head, amusement dancing in his dark eyes, as Elena clasped the glass charm around her neck. Their journey had only just begun, and already the island promised wonders neither of them would soon forget. Charles sat speechless, fury simmering under his calm exterior. She'd used up his supplies, eaten his rations, emptied his coffers, occupied his bed, and then had the gall to flaunt it all. And he was expected to endure it with a smile? How long would he have to grovel like a lapdog? If not for the child growing in her womb, he wouldn't bother swallowing his pride at all. Anger coursed through him, but there was nowhere to pour it out. He dreamed of a horde of those little Karami beasts materializing before him so he could unleash his wrath, swift, merciless, and very satisfying. "Quick! Message the Navy headquarters," came an urgent shout. "The great swordsman of blood, Rockefeller, a.k.a. Charles, has been spotted on Island Number of the Chambord Archipelago." Charles and Elena had been living it up, shopping without restraint on island, when they'd inadvertently attracted unwanted attention. To be precise, they'd drawn the gaze of the Cypherpol units stationed throughout the Chambord chain, covert intelligence agencies that supplied the world government with critical information. Now, having intercepted word of his presence, someone in the command center slammed a fist on the desk. "What did you say? Charles has shown up in the Chambord Islands?" "Damnation!" another officer swore, staring at the report. "Dispatch the coordinates at once. We can't let him slip away." General Kong slumped over the strategy table, staring at the scattered fleet deployments on the holomap. "Naval headquarters has its forces stretched from one end of the world to the other," he said, voice low and grim, "and with Garp tied up in the New World, they can't even spare a single combat squad." The towering cyborg general, known throughout the fleet as Steelbone Kong, pressed his metal-clad hand to his temple. For years, he had believed in the Navy's mission: justice, order, the protection of the innocent. Now those ideals felt like rusted relics, eroded by endless conflicts and ever-shifting alliances. A young orderly crept into the room, nearly tripping over his own feet. His uniform was immaculate, but his face was chalk white. Kong's glare pinned him in place. "Report." Kong's tone was both an order and an invitation to confess every worry that tore at the messenger's nerves. Swallowing hard, the orderly managed, "Sir, we've received your instructions, but—" "Enough." Kong straightened in his chair. "You're to take the patrol vessel Raven's Wing and monitor the Chambord Islands. Any unusual activity, pirates, deserters, natural disasters, you call me immediately." The orderly's eyes snapped wide. "Yes, sir." He jerked to his feet, snapped off a salute so fast his helmet creaked, and bolted from the office. Moments after the door closed, the young man slid down the corridor wall and exhaled in relief. Every time he delivered orders to the cyborg general, it felt like standing before a firing squad. At this rate, he wouldn't last a week, let alone make it to retirement. Unless, of course, Lieutenant General, he got transferred before then, he thought wryly. Back in the war room, General Steelbone Kong leaned back and sighed. Alone, surrounded by silent screens and empty chairs, he let the exhaustion wash over him. The world he had pledged to protect was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, the stoic enforcer of justice wondered if it was already too late. Charles silently prayed that General Elena wouldn't make a fuss. If she did, he'd be left to walk back alone. But Elena strolled through the bustling street with hardly a care, oblivious to his worry. Passers-by hurried past, heads down, though a few stole quick, astonished glances before averting their eyes. "This place is so dull," Elena finally complained, her voice carrying over the market stalls. Charles couldn't help but chuckle. "You haven't seen anything yet. The real excitement in the Chambord Islands lies between Island 30 and Island 49. Those 20 islands are where all the fun happens." Elena stopped and shot him a fiery look. "Then tell me about them." She planted her hands firmly on her hips and started marching toward the ferry terminal. Charles smiled at her determined stride and fell into step beside her. Word of the general's arrival spread fast. As they neared the dock for Island 30, street vendors and dock workers called out in unison, "Boss! They're about to leave!" one of the slavers hissed under his breath. A small band of traffickers had been tailing Charles ever since Elena of the Shiluo River disembarked on Island Number, biding their time for a perfect moment to strike. Now, as he and Alina readied their vessel to set sail, their quarry seemed completely oblivious to the danger close behind. "If we don't act now," another slaver warned, "we'll never get the chance once they reach island number 30. The naval patrols in the Chambord archipelago will be all over them. We'd have no shot at a quiet abduction." The first man's eyes gleamed. "Then there's no time to waste." With a final nod, they melted into the milling dock workers, ready to close in on Charles and Elena before the ship could slip out of harbor. Chapter 98. Beneath a slate-gray sky, the smuggler's speedboat cut through the waves in hot pursuit of Charles and Elena. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a crooked grin, barked orders over the roar of the engine. "Bring them down before they reach island number 30, he snapped. "Those two aren't ordinary travelers. They're prime cargo." One of his underlings leaned in, peering at Charles rowing calmly ahead. "Boss," he said, voice tinged with uncertainty, "that boy looks familiar. Didn't I see him in a newspaper?" The leader's grin faltered. "Newspaper, you say?" He squinted at Charles's back. "Could be some upstart noble's son or a runaway celebrity. Doesn't matter. They'll fetch a fortune." He slapped his subordinate lightly on the head. "Stop daydreaming. Focus on the chase. And when we catch them, I want them bound, rich or not. Then we'll decide what to do with the girl afterward." More boats appeared on the horizon, engines humming in unison as they closed the gap. Unseen by the smugglers, Charles cast a quick glance over his shoulder. He had recognized the danger the moment they slipped into pursuit, but he said nothing to Elena. Inside him, a firm resolve took shape. Elena needed to learn how cruel the world could be. Only by facing real peril, he thought, could she grow strong. Dark clouds piled overhead as the speedboats drew nearer. Charles tightened his grip on the oars. Elena looked to him, eyes wide and heart pounding, but he offered only a calm nod. The lesson had begun. "Stop, Elena." Hishaluo had only just rounded the bend in the cliffside path when 7 burly men exploded from the undergrowth. They brandished heavy clubs, coils of rope, and netting as they advanced. Charles lifted an eyebrow but stayed his hand. He wanted Alina to understand the real dangers lurking in this world. "Boss, it's the fat dogs. They're trying to steal our catch," one thug snarled, excitement glittering in his eyes. In the shadows, other hunters stiffened. They'd been lying in wait, salivating over prime prey they hadn't dared claim until now. "Freeze!" a younger man shouted from the right, vaulting into the clearing. 2 squads followed close behind, aiming to encircle Elena and Irina. But their attention wasn't truly on the women. They kept glancing nervously at the first ambush party, wary of a double cross. With 3 factions now colliding, the rival hunters who had been lying in wait could stand it no longer. "Hold them all. Those 2 belong to our team." At that command, 4 or 5 more men surged out from the woods, sealing off every exit. Charles cast them a quick, appraising look. These were no amateurs. Company 1 of the island militia, without a doubt, here to snatch up whatever valuables hadn't already been claimed. He took a steadying breath. Here comes the lesson in danger. Now Elena would learn. These men belonged to the 8th wave of human traffickers, and the Chambord Islands rings were notoriously well organized. Dozens of ruthless enforcers surrounded them. Elena shrank back against Charles, her usual courage vanishing in the face of such violence. Charles couldn't believe his eyes. He'd always known Elena fearless, yet here she was trembling. Without a second thought, he flanked her and stepped forward. "Hey, fat dog," he called. "We're Sam's slave-catching team, and we've had these 2 under surveillance since first light, so get lost, now." A hulking man in a sharp suit leveled a compact pistol at Fat Dog and sneered. "GJ, so it's Sam's crew after all? Why didn't you let us in on the scoop? Think you can muscle in on our turf? And you," he jutted the gun toward Charles, "how many people do you have backing you? 50? 60? I've had enough of you staring me down. Back off unless you want an early grave." Fat Dog met the man's glare without flinching, even as 50 or so armed thugs closed in. He knew exactly who was behind him, someone powerful enough to silence any doubter. From the crowd came a ripple of voices. "Boss, show 'em what we do. Yeah, crush Sam's dogs." Charles, as felt Elena press closer, but he kept his chin up. No matter the odds, he would protect her, come what may. "Listen up. Whoever claims these 2 slaves gets to keep them." A chorus of junior lackeys chanted behind Fat Dog, pumping up their boss. After a moment, Fat Dog raised a hand, silencing them. Enough chattering. It's too late to back out now. He surveyed the 7 rival crews encircling him, lips curling in contempt. Each gang returned his glare, but nobody made a move. Fat Dog snorted. What's the matter? Scared? Don't think the auction house's rules will save you here on this island. If you've got the guts, step forward. Crow, leader of one of the gangs, stepped up, brandishing his wicked-looking cleaver. He laughed, arrogance dripping from every word. That's right. Let's see what you've got, Fat Dog. Boss, let's crush 'em, cried one of Crow's underlings. I haven't seen blood in days, another shouted. It's about time someone spilled. Shouts and jeers erupted as the two factions taunted each other. In the chaos, Charles and Elena stood forgotten at the edge of the clearing. Charles's eyes widened in disbelief. Slave catchers were part of this mess too? He exchanged a surprised glance with Elena. Neither of them knew what would happen next. But one thing was clear. This island auction was about to erupt into violence. Charles couldn't shake the feeling that the pirate world was careening into chaos. A knot of discontent churned inside him as he watched the brawl unfold on deck. At first, Elena shrank back behind him, her eyes wide with fear, but as the cacophony of curses grew, she straightened, curiosity shining through her trepidation. She'd spent the last 20 years in stifling peace, never witnessing anything like this, and now she leaned forward, captivated by the raw spectacle. 40 or more pirates had formed a loose ring, trading insults like blows. What are you doing, calling me out? You idiot! Come on, try me, one bellowed. Your face. I'll give you something to remember, another sneered. Shut up, or I'll knock your teeth down your throat, a third threatened. Their shouts bounced off the wooden planks, a brutal chorus that made Charles grit his teeth. He glanced at Elena, watching with wide-eyed fascination, and felt a surge of indignation. Why wouldn't they follow any code of honor? Why this endless back and forth of petty threats? A hot knot of anger twisted in his gut. Finally, Charles snapped. Silence! His voice boomed across the deck. The air around him trembled, and an icy, murderous aura radiated outward like the blade of a knife. The pirates froze, their curses dying on their lips as the oppressive energy pressed in on them. Elena gasped and stumbled back against Charles, heart pounding at the sudden, terrifying power he'd unleashed. In that instant, every pirate knew this boy was not to be trifled with. Charles stood unwavering, his young face set in an implacable glare. For a heartbeat, the assembled members of the 7 clans froze. Then one by one their faces drained of color. They'd thought this boy no threat, yet here he was, silent and unshaken. Muttering bitterly, they blamed themselves for letting a child put them on edge. Come on, little boy, the man called Crow jeered, flicking a finger at Charles. Say that again, if you've got the nerve. No sooner had Crow spoken than a blade of green light sliced through the air. He felt a sudden chill at his wrist, then unimaginable agony. Ah! He howled, clutching his arm. In shock, he looked down and let out another cry as his hand tumbled to the ground, severed at the wrist. In Charles's steady grip now gleamed a long sword, its verdant blade etched with glowing runes. None of the onlookers had seen him draw it, yet there it was, radiating power. For a moment, even Crow's severed hand failed to hold their attention. All eyes were drawn to the 7-star sword in Charles's hand, its mysterious aura promising far more danger than any of them had bargained for. At first glance, the sword in Charles's hand could only be one of the legendary 7-star blades, far more valuable than 2 ordinary slaves. Even the humblest of those famed weapons commanded tens of millions of Baileys at auction. The rarest went for hundreds of millions, or were simply deemed priceless. Boy, snarled the man called Fat Dog, his beady eyes fixed greedily on the sword. Hand over that blade, and I'll let you walk away in one piece. Refuse, and you won't live to regret it. Chapter 99. The Chambord Islands Auction House. Even the seasoned slavers employed by the auction house could sense it. Charles's sword was no ordinary blade. Its aura pulsed with an almost living energy that spoke of hidden power. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances, and Charles merely smirked. I see you understand its strength, he said coolly, sheathing the sword at his hip, but words won't save you now. With that, he took a single step forward and whispered, Die! Before anyone could raise a blade, a razor-sharp wind swept through the chamber. The 40-odd hunters froze mid-gesture as the air around them crackled with lethal force. A split second later, screams of terror were replaced by stunned silence. Fat Dog, a hulking brute notorious for his cruelty, stared down in horror at the jagged wound slicing through his own shoulder. His eyes rolled back, and he pitched forward into unconsciousness. In the blink of an eye, Charles was back at his original position, the echo of the shockwave fading like a bad dream. Every slaver stood motionless, their heads tilted in stupefied shock, limbs hanging limp. Charles drew a slow, steadying breath. Then, in a voice as soft as a breeze, yet impossible to disobey, he spoke one final command. Fall. Instantly, the stunned men crumpled. The cavernous hall filled with the sickening thud of bodies hitting stone, and, even more chilling, the metallic ring of steel against steel as head and torso separated. Blood pooled beneath them in widening circles. Elena, who had watched the execution in frozen silence, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. She dared not even scream. Instead, her wide eyes bore witness to the grim tableau before her. Proof that no force on the Chambord Islands could stand against Charles and his extraordinary sword. Charles stood among the three fallen men, his breathing steady. Only moments ago they'd been alive, leering, dangerous men. Now their bodies lay motionless on the damp earth. Elena pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. You killed them. He glanced at her with cool impatience. They were human traffickers. Leave them alive, and they'll prey on more innocents. Elena stared at the bodies. She'd seen the predatory gleam in their eyes when they thought no one was watching. Still, the finality of death made her heart pound. But they're dead. Charles met her gaze evenly. Better dead than free to hurt others. She said nothing. Confronting the truth of his actions left her speechless. With a curt nod, Charles turned away. Come on. You wanted to see the real Chambord Islands, didn't you? This is just the start. Elena hesitated, then followed him down a twisting path of moss-covered stones and crumbling pillars. They were heading for the island's hidden core, known only as Island Number 5. A small hand slipped into Charles's. He looked down to find Liana, the young girl he'd rescued, her face curious and trusting. He sighed inwardly. Life never came without complications. Firmly, he took her hand. Already the faint echo of her thoughts brushed against his mind, an involuntary mind link he hadn't asked for. Stay close, Charles said quietly to Elena and Liana. There's a long way to go, and I don't intend to let either of you out of my sight. Charles had already made his decision. No matter how much he complained, Elena was coming with him. Before long, the three of them, Charles, Elena, and their quiet companion Liana, stood in front of an imposing stone building. Carved above the heavy doors were the words, Children's Auction House. Elena frowned, glancing at Charles. An auction house? What are we doing here? Liana, who usually had no shortage of opinions, merely fell silent. Charles offered no immediate explanation. Instead, he stepped forward and said, voice low, Come on, I want you to see the world's real darkness. Before Elena could argue, Charles pulled her inside. The guards at the entrance gave a polite bow and held the doors open, his tailored coat and confident stride marking him as one of the city's privileged. Elena slipped past them, curiosity quickly turning to unease. Inside, the hall stretched in two stark halves. One side displayed gleaming artworks, rare spices and bolts of silken fabric. The other held rows of cramped iron cages, each containing a frightened child. The low hum of bargaining echoed off the marble floors. Elena's pulse quickened as she took it all in. Standing quietly behind her, Liana's expression was unreadable. She made no move to comfort Elena, but her presence was a steady anchor in the unsettling scene. A booming laugh cut through the murmurs. A portly man in garish velvet robes, his fingers heavy with rings, elbowed his way through the crowd. He stopped a few paces from them, eyes gleaming with contempt. Well, what have we here? He mocked, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. A couple of country bumpkins lost in the big city's finest? Elena's cheeks flamed. Charles's jaw tightened, and Liana took a cautious step forward, tension coiling in her posture. Despite the jeers and the distressed faces in those cages, Charles held his ground. This was why he had brought Elena here, to face a darkness most would rather ignore. Duke Clayton's eyes lit up the moment he saw Elena again. A lascivious smile spread across his round face, and he licked his lips as if savoring a delectable treat. Just as Alina was about to protest, his expression shifted in an instant. "My lady," he gushed, dropping the lecherous look, "may I have the honor of knowing your name? I am Duke Clayton of Sukin, and I wish to make your acquaintance." Irina, who had been standing quietly by, tried to speak, but her words died in her throat as she watched the Duke flip personalities like pages in a book. Charles, meanwhile, stared at Clayton in astonishment. How dare this pompous, overgrown man address his wife as if Charles didn't exist? Before Elena could reply, Charles stepped forward, planting himself between her and the Duke. "I'm afraid you're far too late," he declared coolly. "She's with me." Charles dismissed Duke Clayton's outstretched hand without a second thought. The Duke, short, portly, and standing no more than 5'6", tilted his head back to look up at Charles's composed, handsome face. For a moment, he looked utterly unrecognizable beneath Charles's steady gaze. "Who are you, boy?" Duke Clayton demanded, his cordial mask slipping back toward annoyance. "Which kingdom do you belong to?" Duke Clayton demanded, his gaze fixed on Charles. Charles didn't hesitate. He straightened his shoulders and replied smoothly, "It doesn't matter. Elena is mine." Before Elena could even utter a word, Charles swept her into his arms. She froze in surprise, her delicate frame tensing as she stared blankly up at him. Clayton, already green with envy, felt his jealousy spike at the sight. Still, he forced himself to remain composed. Everyone in the room knew this auction house answered to formidable powers. Rumors whispered that the celestial dragons were pulling the strings. A mere duke like him had no authority to pick a fight here. Clayton snorted. "Humph," he said coolly, then turned on his heel and walked away. Charles stood watching him go, bewildered. In his experience, nobles in the Grand Line were always arrogant, looking down on everyone as if they owned the air they breathed. Yet Clayton's measured exit had betrayed none of the usual haughtiness. Something about this place, and about Clayton himself, didn't add up. Before Charles could ponder further, the auction house steward approached with urgent steps. "Young Master Charles," he said, bowing low, "the next lot is about to be called. The auction will begin shortly. This way, please." A scantily clad attendant approached, her chest artfully concealed by white blossoms. Charles felt a light-headed flutter, until Elena, seated beside him, yanked his waist in a playful pinch. "Boo," she teased. Charles yelped and shot her an incredulous look. Since when did Elena know that trick? Was it some secret sorority weapon? The attendant merely smiled and guided Charles and Elena into the second row. When they took their seats, Charles noticed the front row stood empty. He remembered that those prime seats were traditionally reserved for the Tianlong clan, and today, apparently, no Tianlong members had turned up. Charles sighed. He'd been half expecting the thrill of sparring with a few proud Tianlong warriors, just as he'd read about in so many novels. But the chance was gone. Elena glanced at him, puzzled. "What's wrong? You look like you've lost your favorite toy." Charles managed a rueful shake of his head. "It's nothing serious. I just thought this auction might be livelier with a few Tianlong hotshots in the mix." Elena chuckled softly and elbowed him. "Don't worry. Who knows what surprises we'll find instead?" Charles forced a smile and turned his attention back to the auctioneer as the hall lights dimmed. The evening's true entertainment was about to begin. Elena's eyes flashed with impatience. "What is it?" She looked ready to snap at any moment, as if the tension between them might burst like an overfilled pot. Charles met her gaze, exasperated. Was she always this relentlessly curious? "Really, you're better off not knowing," he said sharply. Chapter 100, I Beg You, Humph! Charles's dismissive snort drew a sharp intake of breath from Yuliana. She shot him a cold look and folded her arms. Even Xing Xing, who usually chatted without pause, fell silent, glaring at Charles as if he'd committed a grave insult. At that moment, the auctioneer tapped his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, the auction is now open." A hush fell over the grand hall. Charles leaned toward Elena, his eyes alight with mischief. "So, what catches your eye? Pick anything you like, and name your price." He adopted all the airs of a swaggering lord, and Elena found herself oddly comforted. Still, behind her polite smile, she was already plotting how to outmaneuver him. Charles made no secret of being a pirate, generous with his swagger, but not necessarily his coin. She wouldn't let him toy with her. Stepping forward, Charles raised his paddle high. 1,000,000 Baileys! The room erupted in murmurs. 1,000,000? Remarkable! Elena's pulse quickened. 1,000,000 Baileys was more wealth than she'd ever handled at once. She swallowed, glancing at Charles in disbelief. He caught her eye and winked. Relax, Elena. I've got plenty more where that came from. Her cheeks warmed with equal parts gratitude and irritation. Did he really mean it? With exaggerated care, she leaned in. Are you absolutely certain? Cross my heart, he said, flashing her a grin. Then he turned back to the auctioneer and prepared for the next bid. But before another soul could speak, a lady in a sapphire gown rose with confidence. 1.2 million Baileys. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Charles's brow furrowed with surprise and something like respect. Elena felt the tug of temptation. Let Charles outbid her, then chuckle over his expense. But pride prevailed. She planted her feet, stood, and raised her paddle decisively. 2 million Baileys. The hall went silent for a heartbeat, then buzzed with excitement at her bold move. Charles regarded her with genuine admiration. He dipped his head. Well played. Elena returned to her seat, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She'd just beaten one of the wealthiest and most unpredictable men in the room. The real battle was only just beginning. Charles watched as Elena's voice rang out through the auction hall. 5 million Baileys. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. All eyes swung toward her, and Yuliana felt her cheeks flush crimson under the sudden scrutiny. It was mortifying. Charles himself twitched at the mention of 5 million Baileys. Even if he'd never intended to bid, that price was staggering, easily more than a month's wages. And here was Elena, tossing it out for a single necklace. Such wastefulness would earn her a stern lecture once they returned to Hive Island. Clearly she'd never worried about the costs of everyday necessities. The auctioneer raised his gavel, calling for silence. After a breathless moment, he began the final countdown. 3, 2, 1. With the tap of the gavel, he announced, sold to the lady for the deep-sea necklace. Yuliana sat frozen, her pulse racing. She dared a glance at Charles, relief flooding her when she saw he'd stayed out of the bidding. Across the hall, Elena, her triumph now realized, looked unexpectedly subdued, as though the weight of her extravagance had finally settled on her shoulders. Charles felt a flush of embarrassment, remembering the absurd price tag on that necklace, 5 billion Baileys. He'd never planned to buy it. It was way beyond his means. Suddenly, the hall fell silent. Then the clamor of a gong rang out. Ding! Ding! Ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer's voice boomed across the marble floor. Prepare yourselves for the lot you've been waiting for, the first human slave. From the shadows came the jangle of chains. When the curtains parted, a man stumbled onto the stage, his wrists secured in iron shackles. His body was a tapestry of scars, yet his face, remarkably clean, had been scrubbed smooth to command a higher price. He stared at the crow, Rudi with hollow eyes as attendants yanked him forward, like an animal dragged to market. A collective gasp rose from the back row. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. She stared at the man in horror, her world tilting on its axis. Charles, however, watched impassively, as if his feelings had been sealed behind a wall of cement. He'd seen too much cruelty to be shocked now. Charles, Elena whispered urgently, her voice trembling. How can they treat human beings like merchandise? Shialuoe, standing beside them, shrugged. Otherwise, he drawled, what do you think surrounds us here every day? Elena's face went pale. The truth of Shia's words settled over her like a shroud. Charles turned back to the stage just as the first bid was called. The auction had begun, and the price of suffering was mounting by the second. Charles's fists clenched at his sides as he stared at the makeshift auction ring before them. A gaudy banner proclaimed the Chambord Islands' new arrivals sale, and the crowd buzzed with excitement. Inside, a bloated matron snapped photographs of a terrified man in chains. With a flick of her wrist, she'd already paid 380 million berries for him, and the sale was far from over. They're all slave traders, Charles said through gritted teeth. Specialists in snatching anyone who washes up on these shores. Elena's voice trembled. But why? Why does the Navy allow this? Charles let out a bitter laugh. Allow it? They practically bankroll it. You've seen that auction house set up right outside the Marine Vatican headquarters, haven't you? Think they'd dare do this without sanction from Naval Command or the world government? His words struck Elena like a blow. She watched helplessly as the auctioneer pounded his gavel. Charles, can't you do something? They're innocent, so helpless. He shook his head, frustration etched in every line of his face. Do something? Here? Under the Navy's nose? If I move, an admiral could be on us in less than an hour. What then? Elena's shoulders slumped. The crowd surged around them, hungry for another victim. Charles glanced at Irina, who stood quietly by his side. Determination flared in his eyes. Irina, he said, voice low, we can't just walk away. She met his gaze, equally resolute. Together they turned back to the auction platform, ready to defy the Navy itself, no matter the cost. That's impossible. Elena's voice cracked as the Admiral's Marines snapped iron cuffs around Charles's wrists. She fought to keep her composure. You can't let them haul you off. How will you save them if you're locked up yourself? Charles met her gaze, a faint, wry smile playing on his lips. He stood tall, shoulders relaxed under the soldier's grip. I'll find a way, he said quietly. Elena's eyes welled with tears. She grasped his arm. You're joking, right? You're going to be arrested for a bunch of strangers? He let out a hollow laugh. Elena recoiled, aghast. Why are you laughing? They're human beings. Human, Charles echoed, voice low and bitter. Once they're caught, they cease to be people. They become merchandise, each one stamped with a price tag, every shred of freedom ripped away. Elena's tears slipped down her cheeks. She stared at him, stunned by the cruelty of his words. He gave her a sad, distant look, as if he were watching something far below. A guard shoved a trembling figure forward, a little girl no older than 8, her tiny ankles chafed by iron shackles. She stood motionless, eyes locked on the brightly painted ceiling above, its swirling reds and golds the only color in this bleak hall. To her, that painted wood must have seemed like a world of possibility. Elena's heart shattered. She took an involuntary step forward, her hands trembling. Charles, cuffed and immovable, could only watch as the girl's vacant stare met hers. In that moment, Elena knew she would not stand by silently. Charles sat in the second row, half listening to the auctioneer drone on about the next lot. Beside him, Elena's eyes were frantic. Charles, please, save that little girl. I'm begging you. If you free her, I'll do anything you ask. Only Charles had the influence and the courage to rescue the child from whatever fate the auction had in store. He glanced down at the trembling girl in the front row, tears glistening on her cheeks. Are you sure? He asked softly. Elena didn't hesitate. Absolutely. If you save her and anyone else in danger, I'll never defy you again. I'll obey every command. She gripped his arm so tightly he could feel her desperation. Charles exhaled, his resolve hardening. He knew intervening could spark chaos, but he couldn't stand by. With a steadying breath, he rose to his feet. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, the unexpected challenger in the second row. Even the auctioneer paused mid-sentence, brows lifting in surprise. Charles stood and made his way down the aisle. The polished floor reflected his determined stride as murmurs rippled through the crowd. When he reached the auction table, he paused, meeting the official's gaze. In that charged moment, nothing moved but the hush of anticipation. Then Charles spoke, his voice calm and unwavering. I bid for that girl's freedom.